If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 26, Harry Potter, Chapter 26, Moonlit Dinner 3. There wasn't a shield in my wards because there was nothing to protect. While I knew that something existed just beyond the shadows and under the green leaves, it was something unimportant, something that didn't need defense, and something that didn't deserve anyone's attention. Once I was done, I used the sequence of painfully tedious charms to set up a small bathroom inside of the shack, made use of it, and set myself to sleep on a hammock that stretched just aside from the fire pit. The howling was what woke me from my slumber. I rolled immediately off the hammock, my eyes wide open and wand in hand, only to hear another furious howl cut through the night. There was something to it, a shiver went down my back. Werewolves, I wondered while I quickly dressed myself, ready to bolt and abandon my little shack. Would my concealing ward keep the werewolves away, if indeed they are werewolves and I'm not simply paranoid? Annotator howl cut through the night, it was almost fainter, but it still carried with it the weight of magic. It wasn't something easy to define, but the impression that it was directed at me, even while I was reasonably sure of my safety, was undoubtedly magic in nature. And maybe I was simply ignorant, but there weren't that many creatures howled with the full moon. Another howl, this time it was clearly closer to my position, and then I heard a gunshot that rang like thunder in the night. Muggles too, because why the foo *k not? Just my luck. Ready to bolt, I quietly made my way out of my shack after killing the flames with a jab of my wand. I opened the door and quickly cast Silencio on myself. There was no need to attract whatever was roaming the woods during the night. The trees were way too thin to support my weight unless I charmed them unbreakable, so they didn't represent a safe place to wait out the night. Any escape route would include apparition. Howling and gunshots echoed in my ears once more, and I grimaced. Besides, this is wartime, and everyone is trigger happy. Another faint gunshot echoed through the night, and I froze in the act of operating away. Unless I was greatly mistaken, if muggles could kill werewolves with simple guns, they wouldn't be as foo *king problematic as they were. There was only so much fear that a creature could inflict in the psyche of wizard kind when it could be stopped by a simple piece of stone launched like a bullet. Was I going to let whoever it was to the mercy of a random magical howling whatever? Knowing perfectly well that the chances of a firearm to stop the creature were basically nil? Was it my business? No. And yet, I didn't move. Should I simply walk away? Yes. Did I want to? Yes, I wasn't even remotely equipped to tangle with what I suspected was a werewolf. Staying was the pinnacle of stupidity. Could I simply leave, when my very first decision in this life had been to change the world for the better? I could do and become anything I wanted. There were potions to distill liquid luck, spells to call forth storms and create secret passages between walls, fairies and Cerberus, secrets nobody knew anything about, and the future of the world to shape if a single man was in the position of doing something about it. And I could. Given the longevity that Hagrid had shown in the books, I had a lot of time to become everything I could be. To change the world for the better. Would it matter if I let this random muggle being torn to shreds? It likely wouldn't. A single person was less than a blip on the radar of history. But it would matter to me. Abandoning my half-thoughts of operating away, I turned towards the gunshots, whose frequency had drastically lowered, and I cast Lumos. Bright and uncaring of the night around me, I remembered when I had first captured Dawnbreak, and just like the dawn, golden light issued forth from the tip of my wand while I started to run, my demi-giant legs crunching the uneven ground like I was born for it. Here! I thundered, whipping my wand forth like the handle of a whip, producing a sharp crack that spread in the night, interrupting the last howl that came from my front. I'm here, you foo *curs. While I ran, my eyes devoured the surroundings, and another gesture of my wand landed a rough branch in my free hand. Matchstick to needle had been my first lesson. You'll learn that once living materials such as wood don't like to be turned into dead metal. Dead metal? Who could say that metal was truly dead? Why would dead wood cling to life so fiercely as to oppose a transfiguration? Didn't electrons move around all the atoms? Was life dependent on the complexity of proteins and cells? Why would magic care about that? Wasn't life about fighting? About elbowing the world so that there was a place in the sun for you too? High on adrenaline, I pointed my wand on the sturdy branch on my left hand. My first needle didn't come out all right because I lacked will, if I were to listen to Dumbledore. But now that I understood a little better the mechanisms of magic, I could infer that I had lacked another important piece of the puzzle. Back then, I knew that the needle that I wanted didn't serve any purpose, the transfiguration itself had been my focus. Now, Inedi final result. I was going to save the people trying to gun down the magical creature, and with Lignovertu I crafted myself some help. The wood rippled and flattened as if made of water, its color turning steely grey while it slipped out of my fingers, only to remain floating at my side as I barreled through the trees. And it was while I ran, somewhat still focused on the transfiguration that I had just completed, that a grey blur almost barreled into me. I reacted as fast as I could, turning on a dime while I summoned myself towards a tree that I had just bypassed, neatly avoiding the homunculus beast that would have ripped away a limb had its attack been successful. Surely enough, I stumbled on the scene of a carnage. Under the golden blazing of my wand, I counted 6 immobile bodies scattered along a country road that led to a small village far on my right. I turned sharply, a brilliant gout of flame forcing an incoming werewolf into a hasty retreat, even if it appeared unarmed from the scalding heat, only to almost fall to my knees when a weight fell in the middle of my back. My wand, still held aloft over my head, reacted to the panic that fueled my will, away. The air ruptured under the sudden pressure that drove me to the ground, dislodging the werewolf before it could sink its fangs into me, even if I felt a claw rip through my clots and cut open the skin over my shoulder. I rolled back to my feet, adrenaline keeping me going and fire once more blossoming from the tip of my wand while I directed it to cover my back, almost like an hungry curtain that crackled in the air. Because of course there would be 2 werewolves instead of 1. Another gunshot broke into the night, and my eyes found the origin, slumped against a birch's trunk, with a rail-thin woman was held protectively within his bloodied arms. A man was frantically looking into the night, his eyes half squinted to ward off the bright light that I was so freely giving off. Hastily, I directed the steely kite-like shield I had created between the 2 muggles and the incoming werewolf, briefly splitting my attention to the other creature that had circumvented the wall of flame that was still standing behind me. The first werewolf tore through the improvised shield like it wasn't even there, reducing it to splinters of wood that immediately lost their steely purpose. Fu*k. The second rounded on the still shooting muggle, whose eyes were wide with mad fear and almost unfocused with panic. And in a single instant, I knew what I had to do. Danzig teapots meant little. Teapots weren't alive in any sense of the term. But the trees were, if slumbering because of the winter. Almost faster than conscious thought, I pushed the same intense will to fight into the birch against which were slumped the 2 muggles. There was no transfiguration involved, the enchantment was simple if tricky and not something that I had ever attempted before. The symbol was ready to channel the meaning that rang so clearly in my head. Fire. So versatile and elegant. Flame of life, burning of battle, brightness to defend against the dark. The fire that I had used to keep off 1 werewolf coalesced instantaneously in the leafless canopy of the birch tree, almost as a crown of righteous anger, and 2 branches snapped sideways, hurling the werewolves away from the muggles with a strength and a speed that were impossible for any living being, even more for a tree. I almost took a step forward to charge at the still flailing werewolves, when I stopped. Which was my purpose? To fight werewolves that for all I knew were unaware of their condition, or to save the muggles. The flames on the tree died down as soon as the burst of life was spent in the defense of the man and the woman. A second later, I reached the muggles, and apparat away. In the non-space that was apparition, I clung to the 2 muggles with all of my strength, willed to push Edmijelf against the tight confines that pressed against us, just enough to not break them apart, just enough to not allow them to crush me. We landed with a sharp crack in a clearing I had prepared in the north of France the day before, inside of one of the shacks I was so proud of, and under a full moon only partially hidden by the occasional cloud. I hadn't dared apparate to my last abode, fearing it too close to the werewolves. My attention swiftly returned to the muggles, who were shaking in pain even if they were unconscious. A couple of swipes of my wand secured them with ropes so that they wouldn't hurt each other or themselves. They were a mess. I gagged at the sight. The man had a chunk of meat torn away from his left shoulder which was bleeding profusely on the ground, while the woman missed a couple of fingers from one hand. I couldn't heal them. Oh, I had Diadem, sure, but without silver. The memory of sacrificing Hagrid's father came prepotently to my mind. If they are to die anyway. I immediately grimaced in self-recrimination. Do I actually need to ritualize their death? Even if I had a clear-cut way of doing so, would I want to? Still high on adrenaline, I had no idea what possessed me to actually seek out the origin of the gunshot, or at least, I was conflicted about what I had just done, about what I had risked myself for. In for a nut. Setting my shoulders, I decided to try and save them. This will *King hurt people. I warned the strangers even if I knew he couldn't hear me. I sat down next to the bitten muggles that were trashing horribly in their bonds while the curse ran its course, slowly but surely spreading within their blood. I started dropping Diadem on their open wounds, knowing that I needed silver to completely close them. Silver that I didn't have. And the man, in particular, was bleeding massively. I need to grant properties to counter the werewolf curse to something in order to close the wound. I thought with a grimace, feeling the mental tiredness of the fight and apparition slam into me like a tidal wave, almost causing me to fall unconscious. And I need it fast. Chapter 27, Harry Potter, Chapter 27, Committed to Change. The clouds roamed unsteadily under the full moon, the cool if calm wind made the leafless branches rustle with a clattering sound, and my self-imposed task was quickly going to hell with the sound rackborn of my charges pained moaning. As fast as I could, I had made use of gouging and levitation charms to prepare a fire pit, over which I immediately unshrunk my pewter pot. Silver would have probably been better. I summoned to me a bucket that I left near a small creek that ran just beside my shack, pouring crystalline water in the cauldron while I started to think furiously, trying to ignore the muggle's trashing motions. Water as a base, lycanthropy is a temporary metamorphosis, not a simple change of shape, it is a curse, so it is malignant somehow, tied to the moon, the hunt. I used my wand to stoke the brilliant flames under the small cauldron before I raised my eyes, staring unblinkingly at the celestial body that offered some faint light. The moon, ever-changing, mercurial, I could twist it to indicate the hunt, but lycanthropy already twists that part, making humans the only target of the werewolf. Okay, this is better than nothing. I started to rummage in my pockets, placing the contents on a near slab of stone. Useless, useless, useless. I needed something that could be tweaked into assuming the properties of silver, purity, innocence. If gold is for royalty, silver stands for nobility, to be detached and above the rest of the world, unaffected by lesser things. A memory of crystalline innocence. I had no knowledge of alchemy of any sorts, so actually transmuting something into silver was out. The moon triggered the change, and if silver used to be necessary to make mirrors, and calm water could act as a mirror of sorts, I already had the water, now I only had to turn it into a sort of mirror capable of opposing the moon's influence, and hoping that it would be enough to halt the curse. Just like I was trying to imbue luck into the Felix Felicis under the lead of Slughorn, I needed to imbue reflection into my concoction. It was vastly different from your common potion, the story of which contained an effect, instead I was trying to give it a propriety. Symbols and meanings. I reminded myself. Dried pine nettles to fortify, to infuse the potion with the tenacity of those that withstood the winter, dogroot and tentacula velenosa shavings to bind. I started muttering to myself while I carefully prepared the ingredients before delicately placing them in the pewter pot. Snowdrop petals to counteract the toxicity and issue both the calm of a stretch of fresh snow and hope when its crust is broken, stirring with a willow branch, because it can keep living when planted in fertile soil. My eyes darted towards my charges, who were slowly but surely slowing down in their pain trashing. My time was running out. 3 counterclockwise turns to stabilize and oppose the natural progression of the wound, 7 clockwise, to grant potency and meld together the mixture. I repeated the stirring sequence 3 times, forcing myself to keep a steady rhythm, grinning despite everything when I witnessed the potion turning from murky brown to steely grey, and to breath life into the little hope of the snowdrop, without blatantly opposing the course of nature. I told to myself while I slipped the vial of sunlight from my neck, relishing in its warmth, a drop of a summer's afternoon, of warmth and acceptance of the constant turning of time. In particular, to hold back the preparation, and to offer a focus in order to mirror the full moon, granting its opposite effects. Once the warm light dropped into the steely greyness of the cauldron, the liquid inside went from steely grey to perfectly blank, only for the mixture's surface to turn into a mirror an instant later. I leaned back from the cauldron, looking at the full moon that was temporarily covered by a wisp of clouds. Come in. When the wind finally unveiled the moon, my potion mirrored it, turning into a water-like substance that had a silvery sheen to it. Let's hope it actually makes sense. Without waiting for her, I poured from the cauldron over the cursed wounds of the muggles, sighing in relief when I saw the bleeding drop to a trickle and then completely stop. The night stretched itself without mercy, each minute feeling as long as an hour, each shiver and twitch of the 2 muggles almost sending me in a panicked frenzy. Yet, as the moon made its course in the sky, the wounds of the muggles stopped bleeding, and the Diadem slowly started to close. I sighed in relief, only then noticing the dull itch on my back. Frowning, I brought a hand over the interested area, lifting it only to find it wet with blood. There wasn't much of it, but I immediately remembered of the werewolf that for an instant had landed on my back. With a grimace, I took off my patchy overcoat, woolen sweater, and shirt, shivering briefly in the cold air of December until I stoked the flames in the fire pit, and I blindly dripped what was left of my concocetin on my back. Apparently, cursed wounds didn't translate to cursed scratches in clothes, because I was able to repair them easily enough, even if I suspected they would remain frielier than what they were before. Now what? I asked myself. I had no idea whatsoever about how the government treated random werewolves beyond a general suspect born of my meta-knowledge, but even then, was I willing to just drop the recently cursed muggles to their own devices in the middle of half-conquered France in World War II? Was I going to simply pop them back to the attacked rural village and then forget about it? Sitting on a tree stump near the fire pit, surrounded by the slowly quieting muggles, I didn't even stop to be overjoyed by my successfully improvised potion, even if I was relieved that I had managed to save those two from being mauled completely. There was still the rather big problem of what to do now. At the very least, I'd need to explain their condition, and I could only hope that they spoke English, because I sure as hell didn't speak French. Then I would need to set them up in living conditions where they couldn't by mistake maul an innocent. All of that considering that the world was at war and that we were at the end of December. Just to be sure, I'd have to sneak out of Hogwarts during the rest of the year, if only to check up on them after the full moon. Since I was already taking on myself a werewolf-sized headache, I might as well research their conditions and try to come up with wolfsbane, if not an outright cure. If nobody ever managed it though, I suspected that I would meet failure on that front. Without even realizing it, it came the dawn, and I made yet another decision. These will be *King tiring months. 17th of May 1942. Albus moved quickly up a ramp of stairs and across the corridors, his long strides carrying him with ease across the known, if ever-changing, layouts of the castle, that he could feel in his own bones. And as he moved, he thought. The world had always appeared in precise lines to his mind. Since he had memory, events, people, and magic moved in a majestic and elegant dance that was reasonable and accurate, thusly relatively easy to predict. It was even easier now that he was teaching at Hogwarts, its microcosm easy to predict. In September, teachers wouldn't be yet exasperated with their charges, while the students would be trying to find a rhythm. By November there would already be heads looking forwards to the winter halls, while January was characterized by a sharp increase in the participation during lessons, which would stabilize only to be balanced by a furious study in sight of the end-of-year examinations, condition that was only exasperated for OWL and NEWT students. Chapter 28, Harry Potter, Chapter 28, Committed to Change 2. By November there would already be heads looking forwards to the winter halls, while January was characterized by a sharp increase in the participation during lessons, which would stabilize only to be balanced by a furious study in sight of the end-of-year examinations, condition that was only exasperated for OWL and NEWT students. Albus smiled faintly at the empty corridors, his eyes roaming through the windows over the school's grounds, brimming with students that chose to study under the sun, trying to bleed off the tension with some easy games and casual use of magic. Actions were easy to foretell, easy to prepare for. Motivations, on the other hand, were not. He sighed while he walked the long corridors of Hogwarts, the dying sun of the afternoon slashing long cuts of warm light on the otherwise cold stone. Be it winter or summer, some areas of the castle proved themselves singularly stubborn about following the reasonable temperatures of the environment. Albus Wulfric Percival Brian Dumbledore had been a precocious child, a brilliant student, a bright scholar, a great professor, and generally speaking, a wizard that the world could scarcely believe existed, given his eclectic mind and the excellence that tended to follow any given direction that his curiosity offered him. Big dreams, big head. The genius reproached himself with the distracted habit that he had enforced every day on himself since the death of his sister. Never again would he allow himself to fall to the temptation of power, never again would he allow himself to try and lead a movement to better the world, given the extraordinarily disastrous consequences of his last and thankfully only attempt. Truly, failability wasn't something he had ever considered before Ariana's demise. It wasn't like failure ever happened to him. Oh, sure, there had been difficulties, even pitfalls, in his studies and projects, but those had merely been the interesting aspects that only stoked his curiosity more and more. The same curiosity that brought him to look around for the Hallows, that brought him to join hands with Gellert for the first time, that pushed him and raised his ambition so much that he actually managed to study both under and as an equal of Flamel himself, eventually discovering how to coerce dragon's blood in many uses beyond the ones generally accepted. Unbound curiosity and foolish pride, how ill had they served him! Oh, how he despised his boundless mind! Wouldn't it have been better for everyone, if he had been just another Dumbledore? Surely, it would have been better for Ariana. The powerful wizard sighed as he crossed the corridors of Hogwarts, smiling gently at the recently returned students that roamed the castle, his quiet turmoil hidden deep under countless other thoughts that spanned from his lessons to his years since he realized that his quest for power could only bring ruin to all. Given his undeniable skill, in more or less whatever field he chose, he had to consider carefully, even gifted as he was with an extraordinary brain, each and every course of action. Given the consequences of his actions back when he was just out of Hogwarts, he simply couldn't bring himself to lead people. There was just, no. He could not. Given the magnitude of his influence as a scholar, and the span of friendships he had somehow grown over the years, finding bright and good people that he could only admire, were he to take action, he would drag the whole of magical Britain to war. Naturally, he understood that war wasn't decided by individuals, but by great tactics and minimal deploy of forces, just enough to stop the enemy, but even so, he couldn't. Oh, Gellert was a peerless wizard, there was no doubt that in battle he could take on dozens of mages without risking himself, but he was only a man, and the conflict that he had initiated, exacerbated by the recent explosion of World War II among the Muggle population, spanned in all of the magical world. It was an ideologic battle that Gellert couldn't win until his movement took over enough members of the ICW. Wizards were not prone to large-scale conflicts. Oh, there were countless bloody feuds among families and clans, and even frosty relationships between countries, but that was born by the natural tendency of wizardkind to hoard knowledge, not from outright malice. The statute had worked for a long count of years, and challenging what amounted to the greatest legal conquest of Wizard King wasn't something that could ever gain enough traction to move the masses through simple rhetoric. The statute had been the last nail in the coffin, so to speak, that forced wizardkind to band together. People were comfortable in their routine. A shift of the paradigm so vast and outlandish as the one proposed by Gellert could be something appreciated around a pint in a tavern, as a whimsical dream, but not something that wizards would normally risk their lives for. After all, hiding from the Muggles was infinitely easier than actually attempting to take them over. What would be the point? Yet, wizardkind could then use magic openly, but for the most part, they already did. Wizards and witches spent most of their time in magical settlements, following their careers and forging ahead their lives much like any Muggle did. Few outlandish personas researched out in the wild this or that, walking sections of the jungle that were cordoned off from Muggles, or in hidden towers that granted both privacy from the No-Mag, as they were called by the Macusa, and safety from Snoopy colleagues. And yet, between Gellert's charisma and the natural propensity of wizardkind to follow powerful mages, his old companion's side had grown considerably in the past decade, partially feeding off the situation in the Muggle world. Albus sighed as he took yet another turn, his mind processing his thoughts faster than most could follow, idly wondering about the whys and the hows that had birthed the current climate worldwide. Did he dare seek out a confrontation with his old companion? No, he couldn't. Victory or failure would nevertheless bring war to Britain, and he simply couldn't bring himself to make that step. Could he nudge things so that many people would be saved? Yes, the young's commander was a good example about how he could do so. The Transfiguration professor sighed to himself once more as he squarely refused the ever-so-tempting option of trying to take the lead. It would be for the good of many, but the greater good was something that he now saw as the poisoned snake it was. He couldn't. I must not. Teaching was all he could do. It was a genuinely good thing, an innocent thing, one that allowed him to stay away from the so sickly sweet power that awaited him beyond Hogwarts walls. Teaching allowed him to hope. To have faith in the next generations, and to try and bring that hope and faith out in those rare souls that were receptive to it even in their teens. Teaching also allowed him to spot other students like himself or Gellert had once been. Timely intervention could save countless people after all, and steering those particular students away from the pitfalls that had costed him Ariana, even if only by making sure they knew he was keeping an eye on them, that too was a good action. And one that allowed him to feel like he was doing his part to help without putting others at risk. That line of self-reflection brought him to think of one Tom Riddle, and the confusing presence in his life of one Rubeus Hagrid. Far too scatterbrained and generally obsessed with magic, he was an element that brought a positive note, at least in Albus' opinion, into young Riddle's life. The general carelessness about rules would have squarely placed him in Gryffindor, his tendency towards study into Ravenclaw. Yet, he ended up in Slytherin, and by his quickly becoming one of Horace's favorites, despite his young age, it was obvious that he possessed a cunning mind, while his general temperament made him well suited to break off the walls that Tom Riddle had built around himself. Or at least to barrel through them, ignoring Riddle's protests. Truly, it was a good thing that Tom had been forced to accept the company of Rubeus, who was so singularly talented in potions that he managed to keep his interactions with Riddle engaging, so wild in his approach to any given rule that it kept the young Parselmouth from growing bored. Oh, Albus was keeping an eye on Rubeus, that was for sure. It was his job as an educator, and while he would have preferred to see the younger Slytherin more inclined to the regular kind of friendships that Albus had observed during the years, he couldn't truly complain. Mr. Hagrid was, with the exceptions he occasionally made for singularly talented other students, extremely withdrawn. There was no malice to it, no hidden ploy to come out on top, simply, the unusually tall wizard did not care. The disinterest was concerning in a way, but he had proved himself more than capable of interacting with his peers, even if he tended to be either curt or dismissive. The singularly tall student had taken the habit of disappearing for hours on end during the weekends, suspiciously matching the sortings into Hogsmeade of Tom Riddle, but since Hagrid hadn't been seen into the village, there had been no reason to investigate, even if he tended to appear to class with heavy bags under his eyes more often than not. Chapter 29, Harry Potter, Chapter 29, Committed to Change 3. The singularly tall student had taken the habit of disappearing for hours on end during the weekends, suspiciously matching the sortings into Hogsmeade of Tom Riddle. But since Hagrid hadn't been seen into the village, there had been no reason to investigate, even if he tended to appear to class with heavy bags under his eyes more often than not. Albus distractedly stroked his beard, letting his thoughts move lightning quick among his considerations. Horace had proven himself well suited to interacting with those two, if only because he offered the discussions about esoteric or advanced branches of magic that both Tom and Rubeus appeared so eager to learn. Since he came to Hogwarts, Riddle had completely abandoned his previous Miss Beevy hours, likely judging it a wonderful exchange for the opportunity of learning magic. Albus took yet another turn, nearing his office, when he came into hearing of one of his favorite students. "Hink, you had to be here." "Why wouldn't we?" Another voice, a male's, laughed as an answer. "Your research is sound. I want to assist so we can celebrate properly." "Indeed." A third voice added, making Albus' step falter minutely. It would happen to anyone, if those that were occupying his most recent thoughts were suddenly in eavesdropping range. "Well, Miss." McGonagall's voice faltered in the empty corridor that led to Albus' office. "Thank you. And he also wants to see if his theory is sound, using you as a Trojan horse to ask his questions." Riddle's tone was amused, if controlled. "I'm just curious to see if my method could work better." "And you couldn't ask Professor Slughorn?" "Miss." McGonagall's voice had turned curt at the hasty defense of Mr. Hagrid, who seemed unconcerned about the dangers of annoying a witch. Especially one as talented as young Minerva. Albus felt his lips twitch as he imagined the upset face of his student. With that thought in mind, the head of Gryffindor House blinked in surprise at the exchange he just heard, and once his eyes landed on the three he had been hearing, he almost stopped walking completely. Waiting on a wooden bench right in front of his office's door, was the unreasonably tall form of Mr. Hagrid, his Slytherin tie loosened and his white shirt sleeves rolled up just shy of his elbows, showing the slightly tanned color of his skin. Tom Riddle was standing with his full uniform by the windows, his sharp features kissed by the sun even as he kept himself partially turned towards Minerva, the third and last member of the small group. Miss McGonagall, very much like Tom, was the image of propriety, wearing even her witch's hat while she stood right beside Albus' office. As soon as Albus' eyes landed on her, she noticed him, and immediately straightened herself, minutely checking for non-existent imperfections in her attire before smiling primly at the Transfiguration Professor. "Professor Dumbledore, sir." "Good afternoon." "Fessor." The trio of mismatched greetings came in a chorus composed of an eager voice, a carefully respectful second, and a genuinely amicable, if deeper third. "Well, good afternoon." The Transfiguration Professor strode forward with raised eyebrows. "What might you be doing here in this sunny day?" "Well, Miss." McGonagall took a small step forward, her eyes meeting briefly the two Slytherin students before returning to the tall professor's form. "If it's not a problem, and if you have time. She's ready to become an animagus." Hagrid's voice cut in, stopping her from going forward, and it would be better to have a master on the craft on hand before taking the plunge, so to speak. "Rubeus." Minerva hissed in his direction while Riddle seemed to be smothering a grin under the palm of his own hand. "What?" Hagrid shrugged while rolling his eyes. "You were going to take hours to ask, and since you want to respect the law, might as well do it quickly." She was being respectful and polite. Riddle earned himself a flat gaze from the unusually tall Slytherin, which seemed to say your point. Albus chuckled at the dynamic. It was an endearing exchange, and one that did wonders for the grim turn that his thoughts had taken. Is it true? You've researched how to become an animagus? It's extremely complex, even more so considering your age, Miss McGonagall. The witch, still galling daggers at her tallest companion, simply offered to Albus a thick roll of parchment and a potion vial, one that had been painted black as to hide the contents from the inquiring eyes outside. My research and the potion I've brewed. Albus carefully took both before gesturing to his office. Well, I'll ask you a few things and we'll test the potion. If all is in order, I don't see why I shouldn't be able to make time to assist you in this fantastic endeavor. The four mages made their way into the office rather quickly, and Albus twitched his wand without really thinking about it, conjuring a trio of comfortable armchairs in front of his desk, on which he delicately placed the potion he had been given. Once they were all seated, the Transfiguration Professor unrolled the parchment containing his student's research, his blue eyes quickly scanning the document, finding it rather well done, if only from a presentation's point of view. Since the secondary components of the potions are mostly to keep the mixture from poisoning you, and to tie together the changing principles, I'd say we focus on the main ingredients, and once I'm satisfied you know what you're walking into, we'll check the potion itself. The teacher spoke idly, his eyes darting on his three students before returning to the parchment in his hands. Well, the chrysalis of a death's head hawk moth's purpose is rather straightforward. Yes, Professor. Miss McGonagall smiled eagerly. The chrysalis is the center of the potion, it symbolizes metamorphoses, and they. Albus nodded minutely as she explained her understanding of the process, of how the times of this particular breed of moth were ideal to symbolize change, given their strict relationship with the moon. The extraordinary professor felt his lips peel back in a smile when he was told that to keep a mandrake leaf in the mouth for a month, Mr. Hagrid had suggested a sticking charm to the underside of Minerva's tongue. It was a good thing that the Gryffindor witch had the sense of doing the charm herself, and others while interacting with a piece of the potion would have had disastrous consequences. For the dew taken from a plant untouched by human hand, I avoided keeping the plant under a glass bell, because the never touched by human actually is related to the meaning of pure wilderness, and I thought that while the letter of the procedure would have been followed, the spirit of it would have been completely shredded. Miss McGonagall explained, with her two Slytherin friend inching minutely forward on their seats. It was indeed the correct choice, Miss McGonagall. Albus praised her, not bothering with withholding a chuckle when Rubeus turned an expecting hand towards young Tom, who pursed his lips in distaste, only to place a black king's chess into the large hand of the younger Slytherin. Oh! The Transfiguration Professor mused, I fear that your procedure has been the reason for a betting spree. Ugh, don't I know it? The Gryffindor witch sighed, briefly pinching the base of her nose, only to quickly return to her explanation of the process. She eagerly explained how the crystal phial that contained the potion had never been exposed to light in order to keep the assimilating process hidden, because the exact nature of the change had to happen away from the eyes of man. I did the necessary spell every dusk and every dawn, to harmonize myself with the potion while exploiting the nature of the change from night to day and from day to night. Minerva explained, her eyes pointing straight in front of herself, as if she was actually reading her own research. They're moments of transition after all. Once Albus was satisfied that indeed the young witch understood every part of the process, and thusly was perfectly aware of the inherent risks, he nodded thoughtfully, his awareness gently spreading over the bulk vial on his desk, his touch far too passive and light to interact in any way with the potion. And why must the potion be taken during a lightning storm? He finally asked. It ties together the whole process. Minerva nodded to herself, likely expecting the question. The storm is wild, and yet controlled, since the only expression of nature happens through lightning, which is extremely focused power. And it is also chaotic, with the thunders and winds and whatnot. So it has a dual expression of itself, exactly how the Animagus is attempting to have. Controlled and chaotic, human and animal. Albus was about to ease Minerva's worry by confirming that he would help her with the last part of the process, when Rubeus cautiously raised his hand. Could the same be achieved by using the eye of a cyclone? And what would be the uncontrolled part of the cyclone? Albus asked with a raised eyebrow, only the edges of the wind funnel. It is true that the eye of the cyclone is absolutely calm, and likely representing order in your mind, but the cyclone itself is a circle, something that doesn't lack a well-defined shape. At the frown on the unreasonably tall Slytherin student, Albus added, Do not mistake chaos for violence, Mr. Hagrid. So even a hurricane wouldn't work. Indeed it would not. Albus nodded, a faint smile blossoming on his lips as he saw Riddle extend his hand towards Rubeus, who returned the Black King. Don't be smug, Tom. Hagrid grumbled as he held back the CHES space. And portkeying to a location too far from where the ingredients had been taken would be disharmonious with the rest of the potion, likely ruining the whole process. Minerva added her 2 cents in, eager to return to the main purpose of the meeting. A very correct assumption, Miss McGonagall, Albus nodded with a wider smile appearing on his lips. I don't see any reason to stop you from going forward in this venture. Luckily, I have a friend on the Isle of Man who's been busy in the last years with the study of the weather, and there will be a lightning storm a few nights from now. I'd be very honored by the chance of being your escort. While Rubeus hollered in joy, Tom smiled faintly at the success of the witch, and Minerva eagerly thanked her head of house, whose mind was overjoyed by the interaction among the 3 students in front of him. MHHH, maybe I'll become an animagus myself. Albus considered distractedly, his exceptional mind going over both the discussion he just had, and the notes he had perused while he questioned Miss McGonagall about her understanding of the process. He had never seen the usefulness of the process himself, having many better ways to hide in plain sight when it was necessary, but seeing the overjoyed faces of his 3 students made him reconsider, for a brief moment, the possibility. He had never bothered because it was a process of doubtful usefulness, all the while being very time-consuming. Then his mind returned to a particular section of the meeting, since you want to respect the law. The blue eyes of the Transfiguration Professor turned briefly over the large form of Rubeus Hagrid, carefully reconsidering what he knew of the young man. He didn't seem malicious, not at all, simply unconcerned by the law. And if on one hand it was a good thing that the young Slytherin managed to break through Tom's shell, on the other there was the unavoidable risk that they would both go gallivanting, uncaring of the limitations in place by the governments. Oh, Albus agreed that many laws were too restrictive for wizards of a certain caliber, but many others were necessary for the safety of everyone. How will they know which laws to ignore and which to follow? Chapter 30, Harry Potter, Chapter 30, A Crown for the King Eye. The train rumbled quietly like it always did as the landscape rolled away under the trails, the Scottish Highlands slowly fading away through the occasional tunnel and turn that managed to completely hide the environment for long seconds. Out of the carriages, the sky was clear of clouds while the summer sun didn't quite manage to chase away the dark thoughts of those that would spend the summer at risk of a blitz from the Germans. Inside a compartment, Tom Riddle sat in the company of a cat and a way too big 12-year-old Slytherin. It wasn't your everyday cat however, oh no. Minerva had obviously succeeded in her endeavour, and under Dumbledore's careful guiding hand, she had become the youngest animagus ever registered by the Ministry. Still, she wasn't the tabby cat that Hagrid had joked about. She was a Norwegian forest cat instead, weighing around 10 kilograms, even if she almost appeared like a boulder any time that she was curled up. Her coloring was actually common for that particular breed, mostly grey with black and white strands that broke the monotony of the color. The animal had a top coat of glossy, long, water-shedding hair and a woolly undercoat for insulation. Tom had little doubt that Minerva was unbearably hot given the summer's heat coupled with her species' adaptation to the cold climate of Norwegian forests, but given the novelty of her skill, she enjoyed showing off any time she could. And even the other 12-year-old wizard wasn't your common Slytherin student. To be entirely truthful, he wasn't your common kid, period. From his disregard of any form of social etiquette at the oddest times, his scatterbrained nature, the weeks he spent in an obsessive research of the oddest topics, no, there was very little of ordinary about either of Tom's companions. Like it often happened, Riddle's thoughts were a whirlwind in which he took notice of those details that he would later bring together to form a personal theory about this or that tidbit of magic. Distractedly, the Slytherin genius briefly caressed the vial of liquid luck that he kept in an inner breast pocket that he spent many hours enchanting to the best of his ability. However, and not for the first time, he found that his thoughts kept revolving around the younger Slytherin present in his compartment. Their first meeting hadn't gone in a way that Tom could have foreseen. He had sneaked up behind the 2 aggressors-to-be of the newbie that clearly was too strange to be welcomed with open arms, especially given his lackluster bloodline that implied a complete lack of any family prestige. Riddle had been ready then, to jump in and help once Rubeus gave proof of his usefulness, or to help him getting back to his feet once the 2 older students were done with him. In either situation, he would have ended up with a thankful wizard open to being reeled in. A couple of years down the line, Hagrid would have surely turned some hate useful, if only for his size. And maybe for the second time in his life, Tom Riddle's predictions about the sequence of events that was about to happen had been thrown out of the window. The unnaturally large first-year student had outmatched the students that had been studying magic for years. He gave proof of being somewhat invulnerable to low-grade charms, as well as being capable of nonverbal magic. A magic that he had apparently made up by combining two charms. Which was impossible. At least it looked so from what Tom had known of magic at the time. The intriguing first year had proceeded in blatantly showing his wit and cunning to Tom, challenging him in magic and intelligence with a timed match of chess. From his words, to his posture, to each of his actions, Tom had immediately understood that Rubeus could either turn out to be very useful, or very dangerous. It quickly became clear that despite his unruly nature, and his unpredictability, Rubeus would be more useful as a companion than as a pawn. After all, Riddle had little doubt that Hagrid would develop his own ideas about the natural order of the world, and that he would do whatever he wanted to pursue them. Luckily enough for Riddle, the unnaturally large Slytherin had soon demonstrated how little he cared for anything that wasn't magic. And that particular stopped Riddle from keeping his distance. Oh, the prodigious Parselmouth knew that personal power, the power granted by virtue of magic, wasn't something that could be either ignored nor dismissed in favor of the political sway that he saw the echoes of in how the purebloods acted with each other. Being saddled with the presence of a third member to their little duo hadn't been something that Riddle had quickly accepted, but Minerva's bright mind and humongous talent quickly granted her a place on the very short list of people that Tom wanted to use without future plans to dispose of them. Very much like Hagrid, she was more useful if free to roam her way through magic. That she managed to become an animagus at her age was proof enough of just how impressive she would become. From the look of things, Hagrid's second year of schooling had been his most busy thus far, mostly because of the added side activities of brewing under Slughorn's expert gaze and sneaking out of Hogwarts almost every other night. Truly, it was impressive that he managed so without getting caught outside of the castle. After all, Rubeus wasn't the more discreet wizard around. Noticing the pensive expression on Tom's face, apparently the subject of his curiosity couldn't resist. If you keep caressing the vial, you'll go blind. Hagrid grinned at Riddle, earning himself a disdainful huff from the Slytherin student and an amused twitch of the tail from the cat that was pretending to sleep in a patch of sunlight that cut over the seats. Even as he unconsciously pursed his lips in an amusing imitation of Minerva's quirk, Tom took his hand out from the inner pocket of his robe, his thoughts shifting over the complexity of the brew he did his best to keep safe. The brewing process had been nightmarish, and without Slughorn's expert hand to correct the endless minutiae, there was little chance of success. With a faint smile, Tom noticed that Hagrid gingerly touched the vial under his shirt. His solution had been more blatant and less elegant. Given the fact that he lived in the wizarding world, he had simply charmed the vial unbreakable, and kept it as a necklace. Avoiding the topic that brought to mind the far too many and way too long hours spent right next to the unreasonably large student, Tom spoke, "So, you expect Minerva and I to pretend we didn't notice your comings and goings this year? Or your choice in personal studies?" A single eye of the Norwegian forest cat opened lazily and rested on Hagrid's reticent form. A frown was evident on the far too large student, and his shoulders were set in the way he always kept them when he was going to use the truth to bullshit his way through a situation. His eyes landed briefly on the cat that was observing him, and after a couple of seconds, his shoulders slumped minutely. "Fine. Minerva studying how to be an animagus, and the subtler implications of the Felix Felicis brewing process made me think. Which must have been very hard." "Hilarious, Tom," Hagrid deadpanned. "I see why the professors think you're a prodigy. It must be because of your outrageously sharp wit." The way too large wizard rolled his shoulders uncomfortably at Tom's faint smirk, only to go back to the topic of the conversation. "I've looked over crossbreeding, werewolves, and I've started to look into building myself a terrarium like the one Sluggy uses to keep that creepy thingy, what's its name? Swooping Evil." Hagrid snapped his fingers with a satisfied expression while he pointed at Tom. "That one. Yes, I've considerably expanded my horizons this year." "And what has your research to do with your nightly escapades?" Tom's smile blossomed and immediately turned devious. "Oh, I can't believe it, you're already started experimenting with magical creatures." The half-asleep cat uncurled from her position and stared at the far too large Slytherin student with a glare that was just as poisonous as the one she was capable of wielding in human form. "What?" Hagrid appeared genuinely confused about the accusation. "No, that wouldn't make sense at all. I hate that I can't even try to lie to you about my topics of research, by the way, but in any case I'd need months free of supervision to get started, and a safe way to keep an eye on the situation." "Is that why you spread the request for a house elf in the kitchens?" Tom's devious smile widened considerably. You want to experiment on the creatures? I'd say that they have a hard enough life as it is. Riddle. Hagrid's frown clearly expressed how offended he was by the last accusation, but no, in any case, I wouldn't experiment on a living creature. I told you, I'm looking into crossbreeding, and werewolves. What does that tell you? Rio. Minerva's opinion wasn't quite made obvious by her twitching, furry tail, but her annoyance was easily readable in the way her claws casually popped out to sink in her seat. Hagrid looked at her for a couple of seconds, as if he was considering how much to reveal, only to sigh once more. I'm trying to figure out a way to cure werewolves. Tom blinked at the admission, while Minerva's ear twitched forward in a clearly interested fashion. You want to? Riddle stopped halfway through his question, seeing the seriousness of his housemate and recognizing the outlandish disregard for what everyone always thought impossible, typical of Hagrid. The older Slytherin simply laughed then, wordless at the sheer, outrageous gall that Hagrid had in admitting it so blandly, as if his success was a foregone conclusion. A werewolf and an animagus are two completely different things, I know that much. Hagrid explained. But you know how I distilled the very dawn into a potion that's nothing more than a small definition to pour into the story of a larger brew. You want to engineer the ingredients themselves. Tom's voice was openly amazed at the sheer ambition of his housemate and amused by the sheer complexity of the task. Rio. Something like that. Hagrid tilted his head sideways while he crossed his imposing arms over his chest. It will take years, and I don't aim immediately for a complete cure. No, the first part would to figure out a way to affect the lycanthropy. Then I can streamline the process and tweak or add parts until something good actually pops in my hands. But how would it even work? Riddle asked while he regained control over his reactions. Well, take an hippogriff for example. Hagrid uncrossed his arms and started gesturing with his hands. Eagle and horse, and the main characteristic is that they're all unquestionably very proud beasts. Both a rampant horse and an eagle with its wings spread can symbolize that pride. Pride is a catalyst for the merging, but that's only a theory. I know that you're not completely sold on my theory about symbols across every field of magic. You're saying that the hippogriff is an artificial breed. Riddle was pretty sure that such an information would have been divulged if true. After all, everyone knew that Peruvian viper-toothed dragons were a crossbreed between some snake and an actual dragon, a crossbreed that turned out to be extremely capable of surviving in nature. Well, yet. Hagrid blinked at what he clearly considered a rather obvious point. I think so. At the very least, either that, or at some point there were a lot of animals crossed one with another and only the ones magical enough managed to survive and breed. When you say magical enough, I assume you mean that the magic of the parts merges well together. That the strength of the creature leverages the symbol that keeps together the parts. Riddle frowned as he hunched forward on his seat despite his standard reticence about showing interest in the thoughts of others. Besides the human hybrids, Hagrid spoke consciously, ignoring the displeased frown on Riddle's features at the reminder of the existence of those he deemed subhuman. Sirens, centaurs, sphinxes, velas, and that's without talking of curses gone out of control such as vampirism, lycanthropy, and the strange whatever that's going on with dementors. Nobody knows where dementors come from. Riddle frowned at the temporary change of topic, because he had researched that particular subject out of his interest about souls. Are you implying that you figured it out by chance while you were off trying to set up an illegal breeding facility for magical creatures? Chapter 31, Harry Potter, Chapter 31, A Crown for the King 2. Sirens, centaurs, sphinxes, velas, and that's without talking of curses gone out of control such as vampirism, lycanthropy, and the strange whatever that's going on with dementors. Nobody knows where dementors come from. Riddle frowned at the temporary change of topic, because he had researched that particular subject out of his interest about souls. Are you implying that you figured it out by chance while you were off trying to set up an illegal breeding facility for magical creatures? The cat seated next to the window didn't stop looking at Hagrid for a single second. She didn't even blink in the direction of Tom. She was too interested in hearing the answer from their companion. Well, I mean. Rubeus scratched his head thoughtfully. I don't have definite proof, but when talking about magic those are a bit. Spare me your usual deflecting, and give me a straight answer. Tom snapped, knowing that for all of his brilliance, Hagrid tended to ignore what didn't interest him. Oh, because you're always so forthcoming. The far too large Slytherin replied, slightly annoyed at the nitpicking of stuff that didn't interest him all that much. Rio. Sorry Minerva. The two Slytherin chorused blandly, neither truly meaning it. Do you know the only two creatures hurt by a patroness? Hagrid asked Riddle instead of directly explaining, forcing the older student to figure it out on his own. You think a Dementor is the bastard child between human and Lethifold? Always quick on the uptake, Tom proved once more the insane brain power he was gifted with by linking the two separated pieces of information. If they are something that targets only humans, then it's a safe enough bet that at some point a human had something to do with their creation. Hagrid gestured with his hands, describing small circles with his fingers. So at least they started as something with a strong connection with mankind. It doesn't make sense for any being to survive on the shoulders of a single species, even less when said species is one as dangerous as ours. And both Lethifolds and Dementors are repulsed by the Patronus charm. Riddle repeated, narrowing his eyes as he thought about the points that the two species had in common versus their differences. But the Lethifolds feed on pain, they slash at everything in their path, they kill each other when left without food. Instead the Ministry has the Dementors guard Azkaban, which implies they can be reasoned with, or bound, it doesn't matter right now. Yeah, that was the rough reasoning. Hagrid nodded. Anyway, instead of having a curse that propagates through bite, I thought about turning that mechanism inwards, and having a species of wolves hybrids, like the Velas, maybe one in which their animalistic side comes out more under the moon, so that I can leverage the phases as an ingredient. That sounds less and less like a potion and more like a sequence of rituals. Riddle pointed out, his tone bland but his eyes shining with interest at the prospect. Hagrid shrugged unhelpfully at the words of his housemate, looking outside the window in order to see an environment that grew increasingly familiar as they approached London. What about chimeras? Riddle asked, his mind already running along the sheer potential that Rubeus' theories held, crossbreed at least 3 animals sounds. Minerva growled softly at the topic, expressing her distaste for the implications. I really don't know. Hagrid looked surprised at Tom's choice of topic. The information about them is extraordinarily well hidden, even reading between lines doesn't leave me with any useful information. After months spent elbow to elbow under the admittedly irritating eye of Slughorn, Hagrid caught the occasion to blatantly change topic, and he turned towards the cat in the compartment. Next year you'll learn to apparate, won't you? We could make a trip to Greece in order to learn something about chimeras. I've heard that the local wizards were the first ones to alter their appearances by transfiguring themselves. It's not really the safest time to go gallivanting around in an unknown country, Rubeus. Tom patronizingly pointed out, but his eyes glinted with interest. Any secret that you hope to unveil can wait until the end of the war. Transfiguration adept at 15, this is a big achievement, Minerva. Hagrid grinned while he observed the imperious-looking cat that was sitting next to the window, earning himself a distracted wave of her tail as an answer. Wouldn't you like to look at how they did things in the past? You're ignoring me. Riddle sighed despondently. Besides, wouldn't it be better to visit Norway or a cold place where she can keep outshining us by showing off her catty self? Minerva's ears flattened against her skull as she glared at the Slytherin, clearing not appreciating the rather terrible pun, but she didn't reply in any other manner. Besides Minerva's having fun in the snow, Rubeus started to speak, raising his empty hands in a gesture of surrender when the Gryffindor witch turned her head towards him. There aren't that many interesting things up there, are there? Vikings have been the first to weaponize runes. Their berserkers assumed an aspect of either a wolf or a bear and were rather terrifying warriors. Tom shrugged. Since you're talking of exploring a random piece of land and actually expecting to figure out something that nobody did until now, we might as well look for something interesting. I'd forgotten that you choose runes as your electives. Hagrid casually replied, how was it? Rather dull actually. Tom replied as his eyes briefly took in the shifting landscape. The only thing we're taught are the meaning behind the symbols and how they work together as a language. It is something that I really didn't need a teacher for. Even if the history of the old people that used them is somewhat entertaining. But looking for a way to make that knowledge useful for something more than simply anchoring wards, something that I'm led to understand only mediocre wizards need them for. The unnaturally tall Slytherin nodded thoughtfully at the words of his housemate. Hieroglyphs, runes. Before the advent of wands they were among the most effective mediums to channel and cast magic. But then, we might as well jump to America and look for what's left of the Indian tribes. Why? What do you mean why? Rubeus arched an eyebrow at Riddle's frown. The Vikings landed in the Americas roughly 492 years before Columbus, but they were unable to take over the locals. Rome still hadn't taken them over, so they didn't make use of wands. And where did you read this? Riddle hunched forward on his seat, his eyes hungry as they took in the controversial Slytherin in front of him. I thought it was common knowledge. It is not. Riddle replied, in fact, I've never heard nor read about anything like that, and I've looked into that topic for a month or two. So how are you so casually sure of your statement? The suddenly uncomfortable Rubeus clenched his jaw, his expression giving off a mixed vibe between annoyance and confusion, only to shrug off his housemate question, and almost violently changing topic. So, Minerva, opinions on the location for our adventure next summer? We can't exactly gallivant across the globe until we're of age, Hagrid. Tom idly commented, and she prefers being a cat than speaking to you. What does it say about what she thinks of your company? Well, Rubeus made to reply only to notice that the train was slowing down, and that they were finally at London. Never mind. The three students quickly said goodbye to each other, Minerva returning human to do so and to grab her trunk, and they promptly left the train, quickly slipping through the crowd of parents awaiting for their children. Like Hagrid had done before, he walked into Muggle London before ducking into an empty alley and operating away. I emerged with a loud crack next to the ash tree that hid my property, and I entered its shadow with no hesitation, the busy months since December apparently catching up to me altogether. I either need to keep my mouth shut, or I need to actually study a wide variety of stuff to be sure that the random bits of trivia in my possession aren't almost revolutionary discoveries. I thought with a grimace, casually rubbing my eyes in order to stave off the tiredness. Nevertheless, I powered through the tiredness and emptied my trunk, my eyes hesitating briefly when they landed on the closed door that led to the empty room of Hagrid SNR, only to jab once more my holly and phoenix wand at my face, resisting the urge to scratch when a thick and unkempt beard grew out of my otherwise smooth skin. I secured the Felix Felicis to my neck with another strip of leather, adding several vials to my person, each containing a different brew that I had readied for my expedition, and once I was ready, barely glancing at the Acromantula's egg that still had to hatch, I left. Apparition was almost a second thought for me right now, and as soon as I thought it, I was south of the Forest of Dean, next to a cottage far from any travelled road, if not for a couple of hunting trails that were little more than flattened grass. The house itself was built with bricks that had been partially overtaken by moss, while the metres-and-a-half wooden fence that surrounded the yard characterized by a lush green grass that echoed the impressive vegetable garden that was set up under a rather large, if slightly dirty window of the house. In this residence that I had found during my first attempt at operating, roughly a year before, I had smuggled the two werewolves that I had decided to help. I had explained their situation once they'd woken up, and I was very lucky that Marie's grandmother was English, and that she had learned enough to talk and act as a translator for Paul. Chapter 32, Harry Potter, Chapter 32, A Crown for the King 3. In this residence that I had found during my first attempt at operating, roughly a year before, I had smuggled the two werewolves that I had decided to help. I had explained their situation once they'd woken up, and I was very lucky that Marie's grandmother was English, and that she had learned enough to talk and act as a translator for Paul. As I walked towards the house I had spent copious amounts of reparo charms to turn into something comfortable, following the large, flat fluvial stones that acted as a path. The door opened, Marie walking out with a frown that she didn't seem capable of abandoning on her features. She had hairs of a dark brown that masked her eyes, a slightly upturned, bodden nose, and calloused hands that showed she was used to work. She might have been 1,60 meters tall, but next to me she seemed almost a child playing pretend. There are holes in my roof. She flatly greeted me, her voice too tired to signal anything beyond the need for me to fix her home. I'll renew the spells necessary. I nodded seriously at the minute and yet imposing woman, her dark fringe momentarily hiding her furrowed brow from sight. Where is Paul? You shouldn't have given him the bicycle, he spends too much time at the village. Marie chastised me, making me frown. He's a drunk. Her expression hardened, if because I hurted her delicate sensibilities, or because she didn't want to think about it, I didn't know. In any case she looked away, refusing to answer. A wholly different concern blossomed in my mind then. Marie, does he hurt you? No. She shook her head in revulsion. Just. If he reveals the truth, you'll be on the street faster than you can blink, and I won't be able to help you then. I tilted my head as I sat on the stone bench at my left, my eyes roaming briefly over the courtyard. He's a Frenchman that lost everything because of the war, his drunk ramblings about werewolves wouldn't catch unduly attention. I understand that. The woman spoke softly, her narrowed eyes revealing the deeper than normal lines that she had on her face. What we have here is much more than I could have hoped for: food, water, a roof, freedom. The Germans don't waste their bombs on open portions of the land, thank you. I stopped the rambling woman by landing a hand gently on her shoulder. I'm looking into a cure, it will take a lot of time, but it is something that wizard kind had struggled against for millennia. It will take me years in the best case scenario. I didn't know anything of Belby's timeline regarding the discovery of the Wolfsbane potion. I only knew that in canon Remus Lupin hadn't been able to make use of it as a child, and that meant that until the later 70s, it wouldn't be available. Those were more than 30 years of meaningless pain for the 2 random muggles I had found myself saving. I'll figure it out, I promise. I didn't say it out loud, there was no point in doing so, so I limited myself with keeping company to Marie until she collected herself, nodded briefly to thank me for my support even as she refused to recognize the brief breakdown she just suffered. He isn't, he lost everything. I shook my head slowly at her attempt to justify him. He's not the only one, maybe he should learn to focus on what he has instead of what he would have had the war never come to pass. Being a werewolf is just another hurdle on his path. Do I have to take him back here? Marie looked at me then, her expression as controlled as she could make it, before she shook her head. There are a couple of broken pieces on the roof and I followed her around the relatively large cottage, repairing with quick jabs of my wand where she pointed me at, and adjusting those parts of their home that I suspected would break down in the future. I had found this abandoned cottage by chance during my first summer back home, back when I had been learning how to apparate, and while it wasn't anything glamorous, it was enough for the couple of werewolves. The potions that I had produced and dosed their vegetable garden with had been more than enough to make sure they wouldn't want for food, while I casually nailed a wild boar when I visited during the school year. Tracking charms made hunting mundane creatures extremely easy, and cutting charms were enough to kill them more or less painlessly. Sure, when I sneaked out of Hogwarts after the full moon I used my familiarity with the area along with magic to track the exhausted werewolves and bring them back home. There was no need to risk them dying in the relative wilderness of the Forest of Dean, and I didn't feel comfortable in half-assing things. So, I had managed to somewhat take care of them, and while Paul had remained somewhat aggressive with me, mostly because he associated all the shit that went wrong in his life with my deliberate act of existing, Marie had been almost unnaturally accepting of the new situation. A few calming charms had been necessary at first, after all, Christian as they were, being told that magic existed had shocked them. Even worse when they translated the being a werewolf into being corrupted by a demon of some sort. It hadn't been easy, and I was slowly making sure that the couple could make a living without my help. Hence my studies about werewolves and the general idea of developing wolfsbane, or a better variant of it, given my outrageous talent with potions. I wanted to help Marie and Paul, who clearly didn't deserve to lose their normal lives to the wonderful and terrifying word of magic, but I didn't wish to become the only reason why they were still alive. However, being told that the world is so different from what you know, when they were already so fixed in their ways, it hadn't been fun. Without calming charms, there was a great possibility for a hysterical fit that turned into a psychotic break. Still, once I managed to figure out a way to make the 2 werewolves move back to their cottage once the transformation started turning off, they'd be free from my presence in their lives. Once I was done checking on Marie's issues, I readied myself once more, and apparated away. After a series of apparitions that left me with my head spinning, I landed in a clearing amidst birch trees that still hosted one of the shacks I had realized the previous summer, the necessities for the toilets still perfectly working on one side of the relatively small habitation. I could have simply pushed through and set up a new shack, south and thusly closer to my next point of referment, but I had months of reduced sleep hours and triple research topics because of the necessity of looking after the 2 werewolves I rescued. And so I simply secured my location with a plethora of charms that leveraged my extreme understanding of the concept of hidden, and I slept. With the next morning, I returned to consciousness with a deep sigh, almost physically feeling the facade of the Slytherin student fall off to reveal the explorer that I was comfortable as, and after a breakfast composed by a single gulp of a potion that managed to concentrate the concept of energy, growth, and health, I pulled out my trusty repurposed telescope, and started apparating. It wasn't until the late afternoon that I stopped the almost uninterrupted chain of apparitions, choosing instead to walk with my long legs to the top of a nearby hill. It should allow me to look a little further, and if there is someone busy tracking my apparitions, I'll lose them here. Beyond a significant stretch of fields that were tinged lavender by the presence of said flowers, I spotted it. The sky reached just a bit too low, its color shifting lightly, from time to time broken by white wisps. I had reached the Mediterranean Sea. That evening found me shifting rocks with a rather impressive sequence of levitation charms, reshaping them as I had seen Minerva do to create the walls that completely hid the corridor where my 2 friends and I had built our runda, and keeping them together with the potion I had already used several times to bind stones together. The conglomeration of rocks looked exactly like that from the outside, there were clams and whatnot still clinging to the surface while the waves crashed on the base of my lastest temporary shelter. The sand was frozen in place by an immobilus charm, and the floor was quickly covered with branches that I cut from trees easily reached just beyond the beach. Those were dosed with the same potion I had used the year before to forge together the transplanted birch trees that had been turned into walls for my shacks, and once the revitalized branches intertwined with each other, feeding off the energy offered by my brew, I transfigured them into a single, flat piece of wood to insulate me from the cold ground. After I used a few gouging charms to enlarge or outright create openings in the rocks to let in the light, I studied critically the results of my work. For all of its apparent beauty, I was reminded that a change in shape didn't manage to approach the real deal. Oh, to a distracted eye the temporary shelter could look almost cozy, with an hammock hanging from a piece of rock to another in a lit fire pit, with its smoke being siphoned out of the conglomerate of rocks. But I could feel the difference. In the same way a portrait wasn't the actual person, or a stint into virtual reality wasn't a combination of events actually happening, I knew that the results of transfiguration weren't quite real. We'll need to look over the walls that hide the corridor on the 4th floor in the coming year. And with that thought, I left the shelter in order to cast a sequence of charms that leveraged my understanding of the shadow, and, with the memory of the brilliant flare of golden flame that I had wielded against the werewolves, defiance to keep away any hypothetical aggressor that nevertheless managed to spot me. It's not quite a fientu duri, but it will give me time to bolt if necessary. I muttered to myself as transfigured seawater into glass that I used to cover the holes I had poked in the conglomerate of rocks that was my temporary shelter, and once I had drank another sip from my nutritional flask, I finally surrendered to sleep. It was hours later that I felt it. Something knocking at the door, so to speak. There was something that had just interacted with the wards outside my shelter, and I truly didn't want to end up in another situation like the one that landed me with the care of a couple of muggles turned into werewolves. Worse, it could be something actually capable of killing me. I was far from the relative safety of civilized magical society. To be entirely truthful, if a gaggle of soldiers stumbled upon me, I would be hard-pressed to disappear without making them think of magic. I didn't even stop to check outside. I grabbed the few belongings that I hadn't left packed, threw my haversacks over my shoulder and operated to a place I had observed before the sun went down. There was no reason to willingly involve myself in another mess. I needed the diadem. If any of the stories about it were true, it would be immensely useful. Not only that, but I would remove the artifact from Tom's hands in case he still went on the power-hungry Dark Lord route. Chapter 33, Harry Potter, Chapter 33, A Crown for the King 4. I grabbed the few belongings that I hadn't left packed, threw my haversacks over my shoulder and operated to a place I had observed before the sun went down. There was no reason to willingly involve myself in another mess. I needed the diadem. If any of the stories about it were true, it would be immensely useful. Not only that, but I would remove the artifact from Tom's hands in case he still went on the power-hungry Dark Lord route. A week later, I had managed to cross the Alps, avoiding trolls and soldiers alike, and I briefly considered to stop in Venice, steal a ship and sail south until I could make land in Albania. The problem was, I had no idea whatsoever about how to sail. I'd need to steal fuel, and likely attempt to imperio someone that really didn't have anything to do with my ambitions. I am kind of down to exploit opportunities when they appear. I felt my eyes tighten minutely when I remembered the fate of Hagrid's father, but what's the point of magic if I have to compromise? So, I pushed away my instinct to enjoy a bit of sightseeing and I kept traveling as I had done, the sheer amount of experience I had now allowing me to jump across large stretches of land with no issue. I tried out my version of the pepper-up potion, which allowed me to ignore sleep for a couple of nights, and I soon enough ended up in Croatia. Keeping the sea on my right, I went south until I could no longer spot the gaggle of islands that characterized the country, and just like that, I knew that I was closer. Deeper inland, I could spy through my trusty telescope both the occasional Muggle village or outright city, streets that looked like a joke when compared to the high-quality ones that the world would see in half a century, and forests. I still wasn't sure how the magical world had managed to keep our kind of wilderness from making itself known to the Muggles. But my suspects brought me to believe that Notice Me Not were anchored to the trails that led into areas of the forests where Muggles weren't welcome, while adversion wards were draped like a cloak around the places where the local magical community resided. It was a gargantuan effort, and it made me appreciate for the first time the kind of massive workload the ICW had to deal with, especially so with Grindelwald gallivanting around. Eventually, squeezing all my astronomy knowledge to map my position and the distances I had traveled, I reached Albania and set up one of my temporary shacks. For the following week, I operated across the forests, taking a few minutes to memorize each place, etching something in the wood or arranging fluvial stones in a way that resulted easy to remember. I crossed large swathes of deep forest during the day, my wand kept in hand and my senses peeled to feel any possible attacker. Once I found the stretches of environment that clearly hosted a magical presence of some kind, I focused my attention there, eyeing both the branches above me and the ground beneath me to avoid a potential magical creature's hunting attempts. I should have studied some methods to track animals, I reprimanded myself, it is a surprisingly big oversight. Once I started to recognize one area from another, I slowed down in my random popping across the land, and returned to rest in my shack. The morning after, I was smiling widely when I walked outside my shelter, my most precious vial clutched in my left hand and my wand held loosely in my right. I couldn't expect to find the diadem with no direction whatsoever after all. With the dawn violently ripping apart the mists that seemed to wish to linger among the trees, I lifted my vial of Felix Felicis, and drank, the purpose of my travel to Albania clear in my mind. While I waited for it to make effect, my eyes landed slowly on the partially overcast sky, a sky that I had learned to recognize as something promising rain in the late afternoon. While I breathed in the crispy air of the morning, slowly, trickling, almost teasingly, I started feeling good. So good that I patted myself down while a giggle escaped my mouth, my heavy hands making the vials in my pockets clink worryingly one against another. And while I knew that I could break them if I kept it up, I didn't stop for another couple of pats. It wasn't quite like being high, even if in hindsight, it totally was, and the strange feeling of having a sudden wish to check upon the pile of fluvial rocks that I had arranged as a wobbling tower between a rather large oak and an almost shy course of water. Still, between the patting myself down to make sure I was still all here, and my amazement at the sheer feeling that accompanied the drinking of a perfectly brewed Felix Felicis, I found myself laughing softly, knowing that I would finally complete one of the most important goals I had established for myself for the time being. The soft crack that signed the rearranging of space to account for my presence didn't echo further than the clearing I was in, and before the Felix could nudge me, my eyes landed on my random attempt at Zen crafted when I running out of tricks to memorize places. The stones that I had calmly piled one over another in a moment of boredom until they reached my knee, they had toppled on one side, and my creation was destroyed. My attention seemed to zoom on its own on the way the dirt had been moved. A foot. I blinked, and instinctively I started to walk towards the signs on the ground, luck making sure that I wouldn't get lost. It took me less and less time to recognize the distinctly human tracks on the ground, and while a part of my mind was aware of the kind of alarm it should be in, but my only reaction was to cast a silencio on myself, my movement becoming quiet as I leveraged the hidden properties of shadow. Just like a shadow, my long legs carried me across the uneven ground of the forest, while I felt a light breeze blow against my face and another tap of my wand made me unnoticeable, my presence among the trees just as important as the existence of leaves on them. That is to say, appropriate and not needing any closer inspection. After a while the tracks lightened, as if the one making them stopped throwing a tantrum. He or she was enraged and broke my pile of rocks before stomping away in a hissy fit. Just when I lost the tracks and I almost started to rely on sheer dumb luck in order to figure out the next direction I should take, I heard something carried to me by the breeze, and with my interest piqued, I turned right after a singularly impressive fir tree. My eyes, now that they no longer were needed to be peeled on the ground to give me a direction to follow, roamed over the area, and I felt a distant surprise colored with amazement when I noticed that the trees were stretching upwards in ways that I suspected couldn't be achieved by Muggle means. The canopy was so thick and heavy that only moss grew on the ground and over the side of the tree trunks, for no light directly reached the ground. Not only it was dark, but there was some mist lingering just at the height of my calves, which would have made following tracks utterly impossible. Another element that made me realize I had stumbled into a magical forest was that the very faint breeze that kept blowing against me didn't manage to move the almost milky mist on the ground. Suddenly, I felt that I should stop to rest, and so I did, sitting on a moss-covered root while my back leaned against a tree trunk. The fool thinks he can move freely without consequence. A male's heavily accented French voice came to my ears as I stopped moving, my frame hidden almost perfectly in the half-light of the deep forest I was in. "Why are you making me talk this inane language again?" A female replied, her accent almost unnoticeable as I heard her light steps casually kicking on the moss-covered ground. "The wizard's unrest is dangerous for us, Britain has been left largely alone, we're going to move there, I hear it rains often." The male replied. "I spotted this one moving across the countryside last year, we could use him to hop through the border, Britain isolationist policy works well against us." A snort followed the start of the explanation, the woman clearly bored, you mean that you didn't dry him when he casually charged off at a couple of werewolves? And you won't be fooling anyone anytime soon into thinking you're English. Were these ones the thing that I felt on the Mediterranean coast of France? I asked myself in the half-aware state that defined the effect of the Felix Felicis. The part of my mind that still operated more or less regularly stilled in temporary fear, while the eager and relaxed side of me that still so clearly worked under the effects of the Felix had me fish out a particular vial from one of my pockets, a vial that only now I noticed had a small, infinitesimal crack near the top. Did I cause this when I patted myself down before? Without thinking, with a jerking motion of my hand, I flung away the vial containing dawnbreak, lest it exploded searing pure sunlight not my eyes. The flash that followed when the vial broke open on a single rock jutting out of the moss-covered ground came and went as fast as the first moment in which the sun poked its head over the horizon, the light searing and unforgiving outrunning my mundane perception, but leaving behind a pleasant sense of warmth and peace. The two voices that I had followed for the last stretch of the forest were quite obviously gone. I rose to my feet feeling a wide smile stretch my features, and I noticed with another surge of joy that the milky mist that had clung to the surface of the moss-covered ground was noticeably absent. Once I turned around to the tree I had been resting behind, my eyes immediately recognized the ash smeared in a grey streak over the moss, vampires. I stated, grateful for my almost casual creation of something so useful. But my attention was soon called to the side of the clearing, where a familiar, milky white wall of mist was unraveling between two willow trees. Almost like a door breaking apart, the mist fell in wisps of smoke that vanished before they could reach the ground, revealing a quiet, still pool of crystalline water being held in a perfectly circular arrangement of roots that shone with dew, revealing the earthy color of their wood. I walked forward, my steps avoiding the pool of water that I could feel was trying to recover from the blast of dawnbreak, slowly exhaling once more wisps of milky white mist, and in the hollow of one willow tree in particular, one whose leaves had an almost silvery tint, I found it. A sliver circlet with flowing etchings proving the mastery of those that had crafted it, it had a equally silver raven on the front, one that stared forward, with its flared open wings stretching backwards until they became the sides of the diadem itself, and a sapphire of the dimension of a quail egg that was way too blue to be mundane held in its claws. Only once I fished it out of the hollow tree my eyes landed between the knotted roots at my feet, roots that sneaked almost flowingly around the basin holding the water that was the source of the white mist, and deep within the shadow cast on the ground, the whitered remains of a human skull stared at me with almost accusing empty eye sockets. Helena. With no hesitation, my hands closed tighter on the diadem, and after a last look cast on the ground, I turned my back, tucking the diadem safely in an empty Harvey sack that I had prepared for the occasion, and walked out of the small groove, never looking back. A part of me, undoubtedly fed by the effects of the Felix, knew that the protection that the dying woman had weaved in her last moments would repair itself perfectly, that the ashes left behind by the dead vampires were going to be absorbed by the moss, and that I had treaded too carefully to leave tracks after the first rain came. My next apparition, still Felix directed, led me back to the shelter I had built near the forest, and I watched with interest as I made sure that none of my Balonins were left behind, only to blink while I giggled and I set the shelter on fire. The flame blossomed out of the tip of my wand before I could actually start thinking about it, and I laughed out loud when I realized that there would be no traces left of my presence here. The fire wouldn't even spread to the rest of the forest. It promised to rain after all. Chapter 34, Harry Potter, Chapter 34, Wit Beyond Measure I. The place I was standing in was defined by an odorless, grey smoke that behaved almost but not quite like mist, clinging to itself while I realized that there was no floor, no ceilings, and no walls surrounding me. And yet I stood. I turned around slowly, the absolute silence almost ringing with gravitas in my ears as I tried to understand the nature of what I was witnessing. After recovering the diadem and hiding my tracks, I had raced back to my home, occasionally deviating from my planned chain of apparitions in order to follow the whims of the Felix Felicis before its benefic effects faded completely from my system. Where the hell? I had returned home and emptied my pockets and travelling sack, only to sit in my enlarged armchair and I am in the diadem. I remembered placing the enchanted artifact over my brow before trying to discover how to use it, if it indeed could be used for something. Well done. A familiar voice sounded out of the smoke, and as I turned, I immediately stiffened. Walking towards me throughout the shapeless surroundings there was a man shaped after my current self, but where I had dark eyes. His were of the same blue of the sapphire held by the raven in front of the diadem, and they shone just as coldly. What the hell? I started to ask, only for that strange alter ego to stop a few steps from me. He had black hair that reached his shoulders, he wore a simple white shirt tucked into brown pants that ended at his calves, while his feet were bare and mostly hidden by the grey, shapeless mist that seemed to define our surroundings. "You'll need to actually start using that thing between your ears, if you have any hope of getting an actual use out of me." The man that most certainly wasn't me spoke merrily, but he waved a meaty finger in a threatening motion in my direction. The warning enlightened me to the only possibility: we're in my head, and you're the diadem, magic. 1,000 years do a lot to change the meaning of the words, but you already know what. The other me gestured around the empty room. "This is a consequence of wearing the diadem. If you look around, you'll get it." I simply looked once again, trying to find meaning in the smoky shapes that seemed to hover just beyond the reach of my focus, but to no avail. "So," I tried, "you're sentient?" I frowned, my mind immediately going to the practice of Horcruxes, but no, that wouldn't have made sense. Voldemort couldn't turn a soul anchor of another into one for himself. That simply wasn't how that particular magic worked. "I'm not a Horcrux." The reflection of myself actually laughed. "The only things I know beyond your own well of knowledge are relative to the purpose and function of the diadem itself, and that is because I am, somewhat, the diadem itself." "What?" The word slipped past my lips almost without my consent, because while on one hand it was nice to be on the right track, on the other I really had no idea what to expect from the situation. "Surely you can realize it on your own, can't you?" My copy openly mocked me, making me grit my teeth in annoyance. I expected a trove of secret knowledge, maybe a memory of Rowena's accomplishments, but this. Apparently, my curiosity wasn't going to be satisfied. For all of his professing of being part of the diadem, he didn't answer clearly to my questions. Almost as if. "There you are." Reflection me crowed, clapping loudly in the hollow place in which we were having our conversation. "You are helping me figure out things." I tried, but without giving me the answers directly. The path to knowledge enriches with every step, even when there is nothing at the end of the road. Not me coaxed me to go on, the actual function of the diadem becoming clearer and clearer with each second. Intelligence cannot be actually defined, something that aleatory, there is no easy symbol for it either. I returned with my mind to all I knew about enchantments and rituals that could power up magic or wards or anything that was meant as an adaptive piece of magic. "And you're presenting yourself as a reflection of me, albeit with sapphire blue eyes. You're a wall for me to bounce off my ideas, scaled off to 11, aren't you? And what does one reaches by confronting oneself?" Reflection me wondered, his smile widening impossibly over his features. "I aid your learning, as you've already discovered, but what does my existence symbolize, given that I'm the product of the enchantments of Rowena Ravenclaw?" Wisdom through opposition. I frowned, trying to put into words my suspects, only for the other me to shrug unhelpfully. "Wit beyond measure." He taunted me, awaiting an actual attempt on my part before he committed to an answer. "Knowledge is power." My copy rolled his shoulders as he studied the meaningless smoke surrounding us. "That is a gross oversimplification. The application of the implications of knowledge can generate power, but power without direction is a tool for the truly wise, and the wise become so through experience, which is another word that expresses knowledge of both one's own self and the outside reality." While I tried to untangle the knowingly twisted sentence that my copy had delivered, I could already feel a powerful migraine start at the base of my temples. "You decided to change the world for the better, and yet you didn't touch Riddle." Mirror me pointed out, changing the topic as if he was deliberately trying to provoke me. Which, to be fair, could very well be the truth. "You choose greatness more out of fear of irrelevance than out of a sense of duty." My other self took another step forward, almost poking me in the chest in an aggressive manner that was discordant with his calm tone. I grimaced at the words that summed up that recurrent doubt I had, in a manner much more brutal than the one I felt I deserved, but other me wasn't done yet. When magic is involved, lying to yourself can become crippling. And the diadem's magic is set to hammer into my head my own doubts and fears. I frowned as I still tried to figure out what the hell the diadem was supposed to be doing. Truth frees the mind. Mirror me tilted his head in a way that I hoped wasn't mimicking my actions when I was intrigued about something, and spoke again. "You want the greatness, you want pure creation, you want to be the one capable of feats others wouldn't even be able to dream about. I know that already." I waved a hand dismissively, but there was no levity in my voice. I could tell that the self that the diadem had shaped was trying to make a point. "Do you?" The annoying me that the diadem had created questioned me with a mocking tilt to his voice. "From what I see," and his eyes flashed sapphire blue as he spoke. "You still act as if you wish for greatness as something evil unto itself, something that must be turned towards the bettering of the world in every detail, treading carefully. A single step away from murdering a kid that you know only as of the one that is going to bring years of gorilla to the United Kingdom far in the future, despite the great strides you've been able to take in want subjects thanks to his prodding. I frowned distastefully at the last comment. I would have managed even without him. I was a bloody adult that had seen a lot of sci-fi, manga, and whatnot. I had more ideas rolling in my head about what I could use magic for than anyone else, and even if I had exploited Tom Riddle a little, that didn't take anything away from my innovative approach, nor from my results. And yet, as soon as you could, you hid magic, most evil and secrets of the darkest arts, along with the book on rituals. Well, I snorted disdainfully as I crossed my arms, forgive me if I feel like that choice is one of the few correct ones that I've taken this far. A choice made out of fear, other me smiled mirthlessly, something to cripple the growth of the one you fear to see as Lord Voldemort. My fists tightened over my arms as I remained silent. There was nothing to say on that particular topic. Riddle had to be killed eventually. I knew that even if I had chosen to wait to see if my influence had been enough to push him in another direction. A kingdom should be fit for its ruler. The shape that the diadem had created with my features took a quiet step forward, his blue eyes shining coldly in the smoky room around us. If you want to kill him, out of fear for something that could never come to pass, then do so, he shrugged, clearly expressing how he couldn't care less about it. But if you intend to use him as a bouncing board, you'll have to allow him to do the same. Keep for yourself the ideas personally tailored for you, but if you truly wish to be the best you can, without a doubt Riddle's presence in your life, either as an equal or an opposite, will be a great boon. Chapter 35, Harry Potter, Chapter 35, Wit Beyond Measure 2. If you want to kill him, out of fear for something that could never come to pass, then do so, he shrugged, clearly expressing how he couldn't care less about it. But if you intend to use him as a bouncing board, you'll have to allow him to do the same. Keep for yourself the ideas personally tailored for you, but if you truly wish to be the best you can, without a doubt Riddle's presence in your life, either as an equal or an opposite, will be a great boon. The mere implications of what he was saying were staggering, and I felt my outrage at the situation slip between my lips as I lost my composure. I had invested a lot to obtain the diadem in a safe manner, and this was the result? A voice in my head that pointed at being as annoying as it could be? You want me to? I want nothing. Other me cut me off before my rising voice could attempt echoing in the smoky room that was surrounding us. I am merely a reflection aimed at the cracks in your head. Cracks. I mumbled, disliking the implication while my arms unfurled from their crossed position, my muscles twitching as I felt the need to punch my mirror self in the face. Hypocrisy turns a mind into a brittle thing, and pushed as you are by the wish for greatness, it wouldn't do to allow complacency or fear to make you blind to your own faults. With this sentence, a technical question naturally rose to the forefront of my mind, and I decided to change topic. So you wouldn't needle someone else like you're doing with me? I only make those questions and observations that are needed for someone to make informed choices. Other me smiled openly. The answers will always come from you. I rubbed small circles around my temples as I took a deep breath. What kind of answers? To the questions you choose. Mirror me spoke as if what I had just asked was dumb, and in hindsight, I could appreciate how being annoying seemed effective to push me towards obtaining results faster than a calm, peaceful conversation would have. Ultimately, you'll wear the diadem to seek wisdom, but the answers you'll be able to build in here will be about those questions that you cannot always express consciously. I clenched my eyes shut as the migraine seemed to reach a crescendo. Make your choice, and act upon it, that will tell me which questions your heart secretly harbors. What? I asked once more, lowering my hands from the ineffective massage that I was trying to use to soothe my sudden headache. It is simple, isn't it? Diadem me used once more the annoyingly merry tone he had used to greet me. To learn about yourself, you must decide on a path, that in turn will shape who you will be, and it will ultimately tell us the most important thing. I simply squinted at the strange sentience I was conversing with, attempting to understand what he was trying to make me realize, only to receive an annoyed huff as an answer. Don't wear me until you decide. What do you want? With a sharp stab of pain in my head, the grey mist ran over all of my senses, and I felt like I was falling in the void. With a gasping breath, I took off Ravenclaw's diadem, reality assuming once more well-defined shapes as I found myself into the living room of my home, with the dying embers in the fireplace that cast a gloomy, if warm, light in the otherwise pitch-black room. Steadying my racing heart, I hunched forward from the position I had unconsciously assumed when I sat on my enlarged armchair right before donning the Founder's artifact, So this is Rowena's masterpiece. The goblin silver gleamed in the faint light that persisted in the living room. The sapphire the size of a quail's egg looked now like the calm surface of a bottomless well, and given the forced self-analysis that I had just endured, I could smother the shiver of excitement that ran down my spine. Casting aside what I had just learned by talking with my mirror self for a moment, I felt the savage grin on my face as if it belonged to someone else. There are no limits, are there? Almost unconsciously, since my very first days in this new life of mine, I had been wondering what could actually be accomplished through magic. Most of my canon knowledge was limited to Harry Potter's POV, and the successful ritual that created the secrecy wards around my home dragged up more questions than answers. Still, the diadem remained cold in my hands, gleaming with an almost mocking tint as it seemed to laugh, the memory of the last question I had received ringing into my head. What do I want? Equals. It took me a while to figure out a way to make interesting the diadem of Ravenclaw. I mean, I've read it used in some fiction as either something that gave you access to a mental library with everything its previous wearers ever thought about any given topic, as a thing that gave you eidetic memory, and as something that built perfect occlumency as well as the overused and abused concept of mental palace. It is obvious that in this story eidetic memory isn't that important when the MC handles the magic in such a personalized manner. The occlumency and mental palace thing isn't all that interesting for an artifact claimed to be legendary. And the simple well of knowledge concept is, well, the MC enjoys discovering and figuring out magic on his own, which gives me the excuse to build up the lore from the simple elements I've spoken of during his first lessons. And the only canon indication about the diadem is wit beyond measure is a man's greatest treasure, never mind that's a woman that has built the diadem, or only enchanted it, I don't know. I wanted to make the diadem something not completely game-changing, but important, something that wouldn't have interested Tom Riddle once he first put his hands on it, but that still held value. Which means making it unappealing to a megalomaniac genius. Chapter 36, Harry Potter, Chapter 36, Turning Point I. The sun shone through the circular stained glass window into the Runda, the secret room that Rubeus decided to build from an unused corridor of the castle of Hogwarts, illuminating in a beam of multicolored light several desks covered in pieces of parchment more or less organized. In the quiet of the room, the usual bustling of the castle was muted, leaving only the familiar scratching of a quill over paper, with an occasional tinkling sound when the quill was dipped into a glass ink pot. Under the large stained glass window, there was an area willingly let bare of desks, chairs, and whatnot. Free to be turned in whatever the occupants of the room wanted it to be, but besides that, the room looked like a far too large section of the library with not enough books to justify its existence. Yet, it was enough for those that had created it, the mere freedom of leaving their notes around with no risk of them either being displaced or taken by other students made possible for Riddle, McGonagall, and Hagrid, to take a break whenever they wished, and to return to their personal projects at any time. Sure, the delight of having some form of insight into the work of the other two brilliant students was something that each of the creators of the room enjoyed in the privacy of their thoughts, never mind the occasional opportunity of butting in and testing one's own original ideas in a new context. Minerva McGonagall stretched backward from her seated position while she set down the quill as she finished jotting down her notes about her last piece of independent research, Enchanting the Transfigured. It looks quite fascinating. The smooth voice of Tom Riddle caused the witch to tilt her head in his direction, blinking in surprise for an instant as she realized that he must have been looking over her shoulder for a holo. Tom, she greeted him with a quick smile, I didn't hear you enter. You were quite enthralled. He replied diplomatically while he tapped his wand over the last stack of papers to make an appearance over Minerva's desk, a frown appearing on his face while he focused, the familiar spell he was attempting still fighting against him as he refused to speak it out loud. Overachieving Slytherins. The Gryffindor witch smothered a smile while she slid her chair back, her expression clearing up in one of open respect when the small stack of her notes became two. Immediately, she noticed that the one Riddle had made looked a bit fainter than the original, the ink just a shade less dark than her own, the thickness of the sheets of parchment not quite the same, and not perfectly even. That is rather advanced, even for you, and that is without mentioning your insistence over nonverbal casting. Riddle's lips pursed in quiet acceptance of her not quite condescending tone, recognizing just as easily as her how much his copy of her notes differed from the original. Leafing through the first couple of pages, he clicked his tongue in distaste before he answered. I haven't heard Hagrid say an incantation since his first year. That's your reason? Minerva swept her eyes over the rest of the secret room, stopping briefly to consider the few nuts sitting innocuously over the desk that Riddle had just risen from, and they call me competitive. She teased him lightly, receiving a smirk in exchange. The words on the first page are one and the same, he replied while he kept studying the results of his last attempt at a piece of transfiguration that was without a doubt advanced newt material. Apparently, I have difficulties with the first half of the spell. The Gryffindor witch shook her head minutely while she walked a bit, stretching her legs after the length of time she spent sitting. Conjuring is not exactly the most simple of matters, never mind of something that you don't know inside out. Yes, he deadpanned while the results of his failed transfiguration burst into flame with another tap of his wand. Surprisingly enough, I am aware of that. Minerva didn't bother suppressing her smile at the rise she managed to get out of the wizard that was always so proper and in control. It is still outrageous that both you and Rubeus managed to follow the theory. If you succeeded perfectly also in the practical aspect, well, what need there would be for Hogwarts in that case? The enchanting of a transfigured element would leverage the true nature of the object without breaking the change in shape. The Slytherin changed topic, unwilling to speak of something he wasn't a master of for any longer than necessary. It is a curiously niche topic to catch your interest. Do you have a new project? If done correctly, the enchanting would pin in place the transfiguration, making it harder to unravel. Minerva replied as she finished walking around the room in order to return to her desk, her notes sitting exactly how she had left them. Since the birth of the Runda, which saw a collaboration between the branches of potions, transfiguration, and a vast subsect of charms known as warding, the room had become more than what Minerva ever thought possible. Her eyes slid briefly over the large cabinet with glass doors that contained a selection of potions that Rubeus insisted were contemplation aids, and she had to forcefully turn away from the potential fun that those harmless-looking ampoules contained. Given what we accomplished together, is it any wonder that I'd be looking into other things that can be accomplished by using more than one discipline at the same time? She continued as her wand found its way in her hand. Carefully, focusing her mind with the expertise born of years of practice, she dragged the length of wood over the stack of papers, almost trailing its borders while she pictured it in her mind, Gemino. The incantation left her lips while her wand lifted from the notes and pointed at an empty spot on her desk, almost as if she was pouring water out of her length of wood. And almost like water falling through the air, there was a ripple above the wood of her desk, which quickly disappeared under a perfect copy of her notes. From the color of the ink, to the thickness of the pages, to, she fancied, even the weight they had as she lifted them and handed them to Tom, who accepted them with a grateful nod, his expression blank as usual. Her eyes trailed the few specks of dust that danced in the colored light that the window offered, looking almost like fairies hovering over the tables arrayed more or less chaotically in the center of the room. For all the usefulness of this room, it's still somewhat bare. You can thank me with a round at chess. The smile the witch gifted to the Slytherin made him almost grimace, his eyes darting from the stack of notes in his hands to her face in a conflicted manner. On one hand, he enjoyed winning at just about everything, on the other he would have liked to focus on the new knowledge that Minerva had freshly made available to him. Then again, the Gryffindor witch was hardly an easy opponent on the chessboard, for all of her competitiveness and occasionally too daring moves, she instinctively knew how to sharpen her enthusiasm into a focus few things could sustain without revealing all that they were. It was one of the reasons why she was so capable when it came to academic research, never mind transfiguration or Quidditch. Very well. Riddle relented as he walked over an area willingly left bare under the large, stained glass window, summoning a couple of comfortable armchairs from the other side of the room while Minerva picked a familiar chessboard from one of the shelves that still hadn't been filled with books or stacks of bound notes regarding this or that topic. A wooden stool was distractedly transfigured into a coffee table and placed between the two armchairs Tom had set facing each other, and while she busied herself setting the pieces, the Slytherin casually opened the piece of furniture holding the bruise that Rubeus left for their peruse. The eyes of the witch followed the form of the wizard almost languidly moving his right hand from an ampoule to the next, his eyes quickly scanning the pieces of parchment that described each brew until he found something he deemed suitable. I still find difficult to believe that we willingly drink anything that Hagrid brewed for recreational purposes. Minerva smiled as the Slytherin walked back to the impromptu chess match, a pear-shaped flask the size of a quaffle held in his left while he read the recipe he held in his right. I'm unsurprised he decided to add his successful experiments to the room, she commented while sitting down, the wand once more in her hand as she prepared the next bit of transfiguration. I still don't know where he found the furniture, and from the way you dedicated yourself to restoring everything that looked even remotely unkempt or worn out, I'm guessing that even you ignore it. The dark eyes of Tom Riddle found hers while he sat, settling the pear-shaped glass flask beside the chessboard as he did so, only to return to studying the recipe in his hand. Why would you think I ignore it? There are a few empty classrooms here and there had been clubs that no longer needed the furniture. Chapter 37, Harry Potter, Chapter 37, Turning Point 2. The dark eyes of Tom Riddle found hers while he sat, settling the pear-shaped glass flask beside the chessboard as he did so, only to return to studying the recipe in his hand. Why would you think I ignore it? There are a few empty classrooms here and there had been clubs that no longer needed the furniture. The Gryffindor witch closed her eyes, her wand twirling in her fingers as she focused, keeping her mouth shut in order to taunt the wizard in front of her. In the quiet of her mind, with the familiar thrum of warmth running up and down her arm, she pictured clearly what she wanted. From the beginning of the process down to the most minute detail, and when she was ready, she drew a bell-shaped curve with the tip of her wand. Out of thin air, a couple of glasses took shape. They weren't anything to write home about, since they were simple cylindrical forms just a bit thicker at the base. I have the feeling that the competition you two have going on wouldn't have allowed you to not question him about the furniture. She resumed the previous chat with a smile while she placed the two glasses next to Rubeus Brew and settled the pieces on the board. Even if I can't decide whether stealing the furniture would be a victory for him or one for you, since he would have been unable to get tables and whatnot properly in that case. Eyeing the two silently conjured glasses with badly hidden hunger in his eyes, Tom started with the Queen's Pawn, following up with a knight when Minerva answered to the standard opening with one of her own. Why do you think the way in which he acquired the furniture would influence whether he won or not the current challenge? So there are ongoing challenges. The Gryffindor witch smiled widely, her razor-sharp focus going from the chess match to the conversation they were having without hitching. I suspected so when I saw you exchanging that Black King from time to time. How does it work? Tom smiled mysteriously at her question, his eyes remaining focused on the parchment in his hand even as he waved his wand, the pear-shaped flask uncorking itself and pouring a generous dose of its contents in the two glasses. More than the looks of the room, however, the Gryffindor witch felt like the two younger wizards that had worked with her to make the runda possible were subtly competing one with another to add the most outrageous things to the room, trying to show up the other with this or that detail that made the secret corridor the three of them had co-opted at the fourth floor into something more. The first time we talked, the Slytherin wizard decided to reply while he started preparing an obvious attack with his bishop. He dragged me in a timed game of chess, mostly to see if I would be able to enchant a couple of our glasses. I think he expected to be able to discern the method by simply seeing it once. Minerva chuckled as an answer, her fingers curling over one of the glasses while she considered her next move. Timed matches, that's an abomination of the game if I ever heard one. He was surprised when the pieces moved on their own. Tom smirked, even more so when the hourglasses I had transfigured actually did what I set them out to with no further input on my part. So who wins the last of your little games gets the Black King? The witch asked, the image of them exchanging that piece clear in her mind while she studied the brew she was about to sip. Even with no further spells from any of the two mages, condensation was already appearing on the outside of the glass, revealing just how cold the drink was. It's symbolic, of course. Riddle replied while he split his focus between the chess match and the recipe of the curious brew he was considering to drink. The liquid was strangely translucent, not quite white, but almost exactly like the edge of a slump of snow seen with the sun on the other side, and not as heavy as one would have thought it to be. In fact, if the Slytherin had to bet, he would say that it was lighter than water. So, in order to win bragging rights one over the other, you keep trying out new things? Minerva asked, finally taking a sip of her beverage. The pleasurably fresh drink washed in her mouth with a tingle she couldn't put her finger on, but as she swallowed, she immediately felt more awake, the slight laziness that came from sitting in the sunlight shattering with no hope to return, and for a single instant, she felt like she was running over the frozen surface of a lake. She opened eyes that she didn't notice had shuttered close and looked with newfound wonder at the beverage. How did he call this? Winter morning. Tom replied casually, his eyes never leaving her form. I take it as unique as his other brews. Shouldn't it? The witch asked with a raised eyebrow while she disengaged from an exchange that would have cost her a bishop and 2 pawns to win a single one of Riddle's rooks. There isn't a single magical ingredient in this recipe. Tom handed over the parchment while he took a sip of his own, a frown appearing on his face immediately after he felt the effects of the beverage. Minerva's eyes scanned the parchment with a speed that betrayed her disbelief. You'd think he'd lie about it. It is a very idiotic lie if it can be easily disproven. Tom replied, besides Hagrid not being the type, he's not as stupid as failing to foretell how we'd react were he to blatantly withhold information, or worse, obfuscate it. No, I simply think that he can turn this recipe into his winter morning. I don't have his hand for potions. The Gryffindor witch frowned as she admitted something she didn't care to focus on most of the time. but even when I follow to the letter the recipe for the other brews, the results aren't quite as refined as those he can produce. Have you spotted the only thing that makes winter morning different from the others? Tom's voice made Minerva raise her eyes from the parchment, confusion and curiosity warring in her eyes. Spring water, daffodil petals, snowdrop, rose thorns, fresh pine nettles, pieces of ice broken from the surface of a lake. She listed quickly. I don't remember his recipes, besides some interest before I taste them. All of that was mixed on a cold fire. Riddle answered his own question, that is the only piece of magic present in that potion, besides some ritualism in the way he picked up his ingredients, but that is almost always present. The witch nodded at the last comment, remembering the notes she had casually schemed the previous year about the care one had to show the ingredients to bring out their maximum effect. Besides the fact that any ritualism applied to how the ingredients are picked up bring up the same kind of magic of the potion that I used for the Animagus transformation, there isn't a single ingredient coming from anything resembling a magical plant or creature. Minerva quickly put together the extreme oddity of the brew she had tasted, but how can it have an effect like this if there is no magic in it? You haven't read his messy mix of notes about the subject of potions, I take it. The sardonic question of Tom made her whip her head in his direction, the game of chess temporarily forgotten. Minerva flushed slightly. I don't have that kind of time, I'm prefect, captain of Gryffindor's Quidditch team. I leaf through the notes he has already revisioned and bound in a book-like fashion on one of the shelves. I would have missed anything he left on one of his desks. Tom smiled thinly with a single finger casually trailing over his own prefect badge before he returned his attention to the conversation. A pity, he commented. He tends to pour into writing everything that passes through his mind, and while he discards much of it, or works through iteration of every theory until he manages to find something unassailable, many of his most outrageous ideas are interesting, even if disjointed and based on vague intuitions more than anything concrete. Chapter 38, Harry Potter, Chapter 38, Turning Point 3. He tends to pour into writing everything that passes through his mind, and while he discards much of it, or works through iteration of every theory until he manages to find something unassailable. Many of his most outrageous ideas are interesting, even if disjointed and based on vague intuitions more than anything concrete. Minerva rose from her seat after setting the recipe for winter morning over the chessboard, their game utterly forgotten while she approached the absolute mess that reigned supreme over the tables of Rubeus, her eyes darting from one piece of parchment to the next. I tend to ignore most of the ramblings that he thankfully doesn't feel the need to share verbally. Riddle commented idly as he followed the witch, the glass of winter morning still held in his left. Things like producing a magical potion out of mundane ingredients, however, means that even in his chaos he might be into something. I still haven't had the time to sit down with him and talk about in those notes he leaves only stuff he's certain about. Minerva shook her head minutely, barely refraining from starting to set in a semblance of order the mess over the desks. Never mind looking through this madness. If intuition managed to guide him to do something as absurd as this. Winter morning, Riddle hesitated before pronouncing the overdramatic name Rubeus had assigned to that brew. He might be onto something with his choice of divination. I thought he simply wanted a subject he could fail with little consequence, focusing his time on his admittedly ever-increasing list of projects. The Gryffindor witch murmured distractedly as her eyes scanned a few words on each page, ignoring the occasional, rough drawings that somewhat broke the monotony of the messy scrawl that so easily matched the incongruous style of the other Slytherin wizard. Yes, I was there when you scolded him. He reminded her, bringing a slight flush to her cheeks. However, before today's discovery, the ideas he left unorganized on flying sheets of paper, his ideas tended to be merely inspiring or amusing, if nothing else, even if they might as well be a headache transfigured into ink on a page. McGonagall snorted in agreement, to say nothing about his penmanship. Her fellow prefect nodded a bit in her direction. Indeed, so, now that we see that he managed something utterly impossible, aren't you curious to see the other things our scatterbrained friend is working on? The eyes of both of them turned on the main table that Rubeus had claimed for himself, and Minerva's lips thinned in distaste when she saw the piles of tomes about divination that were scattered there. I have no interest about that particular subject, as you well know, given that we both took runes and arithmancy. I was more curious to see if he was able to gain a glimpse of what he was going to be studying before doing so. What? Minerva's eyes returned to her fellow prefect with a confused frown. While it isn't up to me to criticize an entire syllabus, I didn't think you put any stock into that. Hogwash. Riddle smirked knowingly. I disliked the implication that there is a future already written somewhere. Very much like you, I despise the idea of not being able to steer my own life, but this is different, isn't it? Hagrid chooses topics that have hardly anything to do one with another, yet outside of classes he casts almost exclusively silently, A&D. And you are aware that we brewed a small batch of Felix Felicis under the guide of Professor Slughorn during the previous year, yes? Tom's eyes found hers briefly before he returned to skim over a section of the table entirely covered by a bunch of rolled-up parchments, and at her nod, he kept talking. He almost didn't need the professor's instructions. Minerva openly gaped for a fraction of a second before her mouth was snapped shut in irritation, her head turning so that her sight could encompass the glass cabinet holding the multitude of recreative brews Rubeus had left available. Well, he is supremely talented in potions. Potions are a mixture that releases a magical effect when applied to a wizard or witch. Riddle shook his head. And those we prepare in class tend to be more or less simple, even with no understanding of the process on the part of the brewer, the recipes are designed to work. The Felix Felicis isn't. Riddle almost snorted at that, shaking his head in what was almost a condescending manner towards the witch. The liquid luck is a distillate of a concept, very much like Veritaserum, and the difference from any potion that you might have readied in Hogwarts. For those the brewer must be aware of every single step, understand every action behind the preparation of each ingredient, not to mention the sheer amount of focus needed during the process. Minerva frowned, a part of her regretting not having the same absurd affinity of Rubeus for potions, but she didn't know what her fellow prefect was hinting at. I'm afraid I don't know what you're trying to say. I'm saying, that at some point he added a sprinkle of dew while keeping his eyes closed, and he knew without seeing that exactly 7 drops had fallen into the potion. He gave her an example of what he had witnessed. I'm saying, that he treated the rare opportunity of brewing liquid luck like he couldn't miss a step, like every almost devastating mistake was part of the recipe, and not only the preparation of ingredients and their stirring. To be frank, I thought he was drunk on more than one occasion. Minerva blinked in surprise, but since Professor Slughorn didn't intervene I guess he was simply. She gestured helplessly, unable to say out loud that her Slytherin friend with less than 2 years of education had been able to do stuff that a professor wasn't aware of. An open snort was the immediate answer of Riddle, whose hand darted between a pile of sheet of parchments in order to fish out a single one. Slughorn was never in the position of stopping him, and the way the potion reacted shut his mouth before he could comment. In any case, he was baffled. Before the Gryffindor which could answer to that particular tidbit of information, the piece of parchment was almost thrust under her nose, and she grabbed it with a disdainful sniff, her eyes reading the words written in the dark blue ink that Rubeus sometimes favored. Humans aren't made to do magic, since they need a focus for their best feats. What? She took a couple of seconds to make sure she had actually read what was written on the parchment, before she sniffed again in distaste, reading quietly to be quicker about it. The focusing tool is either too specialized, crystal ball, or allows for a deal of generalization that wouldn't be possible otherwise, in the case of a wand. A frown appeared on her visage while she leaned against the nearest table, her focus unwavering. I found that parchment a week ago, and I thought it was one of the many things he sprouted with no reason, but with winter morning. The voice of Riddle didn't manage to distract the witch, who mouthed quietly the next words on the page. In any case, those magical foci are derived by, crafted out of, or outright born from a magical being. That was true enough, but to go from there to clearly state that humans weren't made for magic? How absurd! Wands, wandwood, a magical creature's part as a core, enchanted items, magic applied to broom and carpets allows them to fly, the origin of owls used for delivering letters is well documented, Greece, is Athena's symbol tied to it. Yet, wizards and witches alike are capable of small feats of magic that do not require a focus, accidental magic in children, that ranges from changing the color of something to limited telekinesis, apparition, and oniromancy. Riddle recited from memory the words that Minerva was going over. Showing just what kind of terrifying memory he was gifted with, or just the type of dedication he put in looking over even the ramblings of Rubeus he deemed meaningless. Some magic can be performed once and have lifelong lasting effects, such as the Animagus transformation, which is somewhat a ritualistic application of a potion. Minerva read out loud the continuation of the disconnected theories on the parchment. Besides the potion itself, which following Slughorn's very first lessons builds a story, the circumstances in which the brew is used make the drinker, and perhaps the brewer, part of another story. The Gryffindor which stopped reading to turn her eyes on her fellow prefect, is this why you went from the recipe of winter morning to this headache transfigured in ink that you insist on calling notes? Tom nodded sardonically, finishing his drink with a last gulp. Some pieces of magic humans can accomplish without the need for a magical focus of any kind besides their own body. Riddle spoke with a smile that completely hid what he was actually thinking about the situation. Mind arts, Minerva read out loud, which might just be mental discipline, Parseltongue, which is speculated to be blood-based, Metamorphomagy, which again might be something blood-based. Here. Riddle's finger pointed at the end of the page, ignoring a bunch of crossed-out paragraphs that speculated about animagus transformations. Almost where the paper was ripped from a much longer roll of parchment, scribbled furiously was written, "The ability to do magic comes from the wizard, since a muggle can do nothing with a wand, but a human needs a magical focus to direct what he wishes into reality, above parlor tricks. He needs also a symbolism in his mind that can act as a bridge between his will and the concept he tries to use. A ritual acts as both." Minerva blinked owlishly at the rather abrupt and seemingly random ending. Why does he seem so certain of this? The only thing even remotely ritualistic he knows about is the care for some of the ingredients of the animagus potion. I suspect that he's certain about this because of his success with Winter Morning. Riddle spoke quietly. But even someone as reckless as our scatterbrained friend doesn't base all his efforts on the results of a single experiment, however successful. So the real question that came to me was, does he only know about the ritualism for your animagus potion, or did he figure out something else, and if so, how? Chapter 39, Harry Potter, Chapter 39, Turning Point 4. But even someone as reckless as our scatterbrained friend doesn't base all his efforts on the results of a single experiment, however successful. So the real question that came to me was, does he only know about the ritualism for your animagus potion, or did he figure out something else, and if so, how? The Gryffindor witch dropped the page back on Rubeus' table, going over the eager words of the Slytherin next to her. In any case, and she'd be grilling Hagrid about it soon enough, she had just realized something. He studies magic. Minerva's voice caught in her throat as she realized the sheer scope of Rubeus' studies, and she felt humbled. I thought we all were. The sardonic reply of the Slytherin prefect was answered with a sudden glare. No, Tom. She shook her head, realizing how short-sighted she had been by using Rubeus' talents only to improve her already more than adequate potion-related skills. I study transfiguration, charms and so on. You do the same, along with other extremely advanced spells, if your demonstration of before was anything to go by. And frankly, she added as she turned towards the exit of the runda, I don't see what kind of bragging rights you can claim with that Black King bet you have going on when he tries to figure out things of this magnitude. She ignored the reply of the Slytherin wizard while she strode towards the oaken double doors that led to the hidden corridor, an unfamiliar heat burning in her stomach. She liked transfiguration, loved it even, and she had accepted Rubeus' quirky nature as something that somewhat balanced his unreasonable grasp of the theoretical aspects of magic. She had had to, otherwise, she could never tolerate his company, never mind actually taking seriously the ideas of a wizard that had barely begun his third year of magical education. As she walked briskly out of the room, she acutely felt what she hadn't truly been able to recognize before, for all of her undisputed ability in transfiguration, and her fantastic grades in every subject, despite the difficulty inherent of the Newt-level courses, she was lagging behind Rubeus Hagrid. Not to mention Tom Riddle, who actually seemed capable of following the general nonsense of the unreasonably tall third-year Slytherin just enough to uncover the hidden gems in the middle of his ramblings. Without realizing what she was doing, her wand found itself in her hand, and her mind went back to the very first lesson of Professor Dumbledore, to the moment in which she understood just how spectacular transfiguration was, how it was the true heart of magic, as she had perceived it then. She couldn't use potions as Rubeus did to try and understand everything, she just lacked the talent in that field, but why would she give up? She remembered with perfect clarity Dumbledore's example, she remembered the sheer feel of awe, and she felt on her skin the same determination that had brought her to vow to herself to be the very best she could be. Raising the length of fir wood with a dragon heartstring over her head, Minerva exhaled, capturing the double oaken doors that led into the runda proper under the unmerciful lenses of her unbreakable focus, and with a silent twist of her arm, they changed. In a split second, the wood was remembered of the lymph that once run through it, and the doors turned into a thick golden-colored liquid, before that too disappeared, becoming crystalline water. Gravity immediately took charge of the situation, and what had once been a pair of 4 meters tall wooden doors collapsed on the stone floor, sloshing loudly both in the corridor and against the Gryffindor witch. Her irritation and self-recrimination were cast aside, her mind falling in a familiar state of supreme focus while she shaped the changes she envisioned, ideal shapes and concepts dominating her mind while she smoothly made reality bow into compliance. Just as the rushing water was about to reach her, Minerva rose her wand once more, the water rising in an elegant curve without touching her, and the small surf shattered as it was glass. The way in which it captured and refracted the light was used to bridge the distance between the liquid and the solid, still rolling upwards. The crystalline nature of the water was used to turn it into a countless amount of diamond-like shards, which were flattened and paired one to another in butterfly-like shapes, while Minerva rode the wave of her own frustration in order to prove herself. The awe for her favoured subject was reflected in each glittering shard of glass, her determination exemplified by their sharpness. Without stopping, she recalled the sudden bouts of inhuman playfulness she occasionally felt in her cat form, and between one crystalline ringing and the next, the glass butterflies became alive, their colour still translucent even as they started to capture the rainbow their broken edges caused when the sunlight hit them, and from a second to the next, they became as mesmerizing as an actual rainbow after a thunderstorm. And for a single instant, the witch let go of the steely control she had over her current set of emotions, which no longer influenced the transfiguration she was carrying forth in a minute and controlled manner. As the multicolored swarm reached the ceiling, Minerva's free hand came up while she gestured as if to push, and her memory, influenced as it was by her sudden relaxing of the emotions that should never influence something as delicate, precise, and complex as transfiguration, went to the lightning storm that acted as a catalyst to complete her first animagus transformation. In yet another transition too fast to follow, the flashes of glittering light captured and refracted by the multicolored butterflies were linked inescapably to the bolts of electricity she remembered, and so the subject of her focus changed once more, becoming something that more closely resonated with her recent emotional state. Focused, chaotic power rippled less than a step in front of the witch, and the dull rumble of thunder strained against the silencing wards that Riddle had put in place all over the abandoned corridor that the unlikely trio had suborned from Hogwarts itself. The tables rattled, piles of parchment fell aside, and Riddle found himself pointing his wand at the sequence of transfigurations that was taking place, suddenly not so sure that her fellow prefect was in control of the situation. With her bout of rage leaving her along the imposing, invisible but heavy presence of Thunders was flattened once more in something hard and uncompromising, in something exemplifying strength. Immediately, Minerva clamped down on her reaction, her steely will, and unmatched focus brought to heel once more the sequence of transfigurations that had almost escaped her control. With the last spark of inspiration, the Gryffindor witch brought forth once more the doors that existed in the threshold before, her nature as selective borders between the corridor and the room being empowered by the Thunderborn stone in front of her, and with a final tilt downwards of her arms, she swished upwards, the magic clicking into place, and her brief bout of not quite madness coming to an end. Where before stood a pair of 4 meters tall oaken doors, now stood something that was more art than anything else, and that yet it still accomplished the purpose of a threshold. Going backward from the floor to the top of the archway, an unbreakable and unyielding steely grey stone blurred into a flat expanse of the same deep black that characterized clouds filled with the promise of never-ending rain. The stretch of clouds was run through by quiet bolts of lightning that appeared to race upwards, too fast for the eye to follow, until the electrical currents became see-through, rainbow-colored butterflies, which shed their colors and turned into threatening shards of glass and then into the white foam of a surf. The progression from one state to the next so smooth that the eye couldn't point out a clear distinction. Paradoxically, from the surf water seemed to flow upwards, golden like veins of lymph running through it until they met the archway, where they solidified into amber so thick and crystalline it looked like amber. Minerva exhaled with her diaphragm while she lowered her arms, her eyes studying the handiwork she wasn't sure she'd be able to replicate, until she heard something that almost reminded her of a choking sound. When she turned she was surprised to see Riddle's open surprise written on his features, his usual control none to be seen while his eyes left the result of her magic in order to focus on her, and maybe for the first time in his life, words deserted him. Quietly, and looking at the witch like he was seeing her for the first time, Tom's right hand went across his torso, his left was still holding the wand he was ready to use to defend himself by the insane transfiguration he had just witnessed, and fished out a familiar black king from one of his pockets. Still with no words, he handed it over a slightly heated Minerva, who nevertheless accepted it with a beaming smile. Chapter 40, Harry Potter, Chapter 40, Changes I. Sudden changes tended to unsettle Tom Riddle, if only briefly. Oh, he was more than simply able to rise to the challenge of adapting to a new situation, but he disliked the first, brief moments of uncertainty, when his own worth and position in the different circumstances weren't safe or secure. When new children were dropped at Wool's and he had to waste his time to put them into their proper place. He also didn't quite enjoy remembering when he first arrived at Hogwarts and he had to figure out how to become strong quickly, in a manner that wouldn't bring Dumbledore's crooked nose onto his affairs. The other students in Slytherin weren't the welcoming sort, not that he would have wanted them to. He didn't need them, he didn't need anyone. Tom Riddle had enjoyed being told that he was special, who wouldn't? He was a wizard, that was why the other children at Wool's orphanage were so meaningless after all. He wasn't quite sure he liked not being the only wizard, but he'd be special even among others that claimed to be like him. He had thought so when Dumbledore had informed him of the truth, so many years before, and his ability quickly made clear just how far above the others he truly was. Tom knew how to be careful, after all, before becoming capable of controlling his magic, he had to be wary even at Wool's orphanage. And so he had been cautious once he arrived at Hogwarts, blatantly outshining only those incapable of striking back. And his perception of self had been confirmed once more, hadn't he been able to outperform and defend himself against 3 second years barely a month after his own sorting? Even so, the Slytherin wizard appreciated the unstable nature of sudden changes, of novelties. And more than that, he realized their potential. Some changes, one could prepare for, new students didn't need to be hammered in line like at the orphanage, not while Dumbledore roamed their same halls. But there were better, subtler methods. Rescuing the lonely from some dull older years, for example, the alone students that nevertheless held the potential of being useful, either by virtue of their station or out of sheer skill. Rubeus Hagrid had been one such case. In less than a week, he had shown openly his talent in several subjects, he was withdrawn, and didn't look like he cared for making friendships. Influencing him at the time would be so easy, after an opportune catalyst to showcase Tom's superiority, of course. Distractedly mentioning near a group of selected ears how uppity the freakishly tall first year was, how unworthy he was of outshining some students whose blood was pure. That was all it took. And older cousins, usually the dumber ones, were always ready to show his place to the lonely first year. And Rubeus Hagrid, with less than 1 week of magical education, hadn't even felt the spells impacting over him, while silently incapacitating the duo attacking him, disarming them and humiliating them by placing their wands where they'd be seen were the attackers to retrieve them. Then, of course, it came down to the utterly banal challenge at chess, even if with a twist, timed chess, who played with less than a minute for each player. Then again, Tom immediately spotted that the game was an excuse to watch an enchantment. Not only Rubeus Hagrid had managed to barrel through an ambush, but he also had known somehow, that Riddle would be capable of magic the tall first year hungered for. And Tom knew that kind of hunger, didn't he? Wouldn't it be child's play, to feed it while reeling in the suddenly much more valuable piece that everybody else was so willing to leave alone? The ability and talent of Hagrid had been an unexpected change, but one that was relatively easy to adjust for. His personality, however, was a wholly different kettle of fish. While he thought all of these things and more, Tom Riddle strode purposefully across the dimly lit corridors of Hogwarts dungeons, his rather exceptional brain awhirl with considerations about the recent events. Hagrid had always been different. Since Riddle first observed Rubeus casually shrug off the standard hazing during his first year, in which he might or might not have had a hand in, and the following power play, he had been intrigued, and rightfully so. The more he peered into the younger Slytherin's methods and theories, the more there was to observe and learn. And the less he understood of the unnaturally tall student. After crossing yet another empty corridor, Tom slid behind a suit of armor and stilled, his eyes roaming carefully over the smooth stone until they caught on the smallest crease, just where the flickering light of a faraway torch faded into the persistent shadows. A coiled snake had been edged into the wall. Oh, Riddle understood being driven, and he understood being more than simply capable, but Hagrid was just. Leaning forward, he brought his lips next to the coiled snake and let out a quiet hiss, barely enough for his own ears to pick up on it. At his command, the snake quivered while remaining in place, and the stone wall next to it seemed to shimmer. With no hesitation, the Slytherin walked straight through the illusion, distractedly noticing how remarkably similar it was to the 9 3/4 barrier, and quickly entering in a now damp environment, his eyes quickly adapting to the dim light that seemed to seep through the black stones composing the ceiling above his head. He takes the most basic principles of each subject and applies them, almost sideways. He murmured to himself, still focusing on the younger student's achievements. His logic is unconventional, but given his results, I can hardly ignore it. And how had Hagrid known that Minerva would turn out to be special in her own manner? She wasn't prone to questioning what she was told by the professors, she had never been one to freely experiment with any piece of magic, never mind transfiguration, which was infamous for the potentially disastrous side effects. But nothing about her display with the Runda's door was common. And yet Hagrid approached her in his first year, dragging the two of us together soon after. It irked, having to recognize the potential and the skill of another wizard, let alone two. Tom had never been good at being anything less than the best, and he had never been a very patient person. If he wanted something, he took it. If he wanted something to happen, he willed it or puppeteered one of the countless, witless people around in order to make it happen in his stead. As he walked, his feet clacked almost gently against the stone floor while he whipped out his yew and phoenix feather wand, luxuriating as always in the rush of power that ran through him. A white, uncaring light blossomed in front of the young wizard as he kept moving, his mind trying to unravel the puzzle that Hagrid represented. Reeling Rubeus into Tom's control through the first's hunger for advanced magic had proven ineffective as soon as Hagrid brought Riddle and Minerva together, blatantly ignoring the age-old instinct of hoarding knowledge in order to obtain power, instead almost forcing them all to cooperate. At least the insight I gained from Minerva's work wasn't useless. The Slytherin prefect murmured as he kept moving, his summoned light managing to show him where to place his feet as he walked deeper and deeper into the earth. Back during Rubeus' first year, the unlikely trio composed by the two Slytherin wizard and the Gryffindor witch hadn't discovered a secret hammer space, as Hagrid wished to name it, since the Animagus transformation simply didn't work like that. But there was an endless number of implications born from the littlest detail of each step of the preparation of the potion Minerva had to harmonize herself with. Implications that Rubeus had been quick to catch on, if his migraine-inducing notes were any proof. Rubeus, who was a half-giant, no matter how he claimed to wear a protective charm, his size was an obvious proof of it, was just unique. The mere existence of Hagrid rubbed Tom the wrong way, extraordinary in his own way, strange in a way that set him apart from the crowd of students in the same way Riddle was set apart in the orphanage. Removing Rubeus had been Riddle's first instinct. He remembered with perfect clarity the first days after their meeting, the hours spent thinking about a way to make him disappear without attracting Dumbledore's attention. But between the resourcefulness of Hagrid, and the personal risk tied to the mere attempt of getting rid of the half-giant, there simply hadn't been a way, not a safe one at least. And Riddle wasn't one used to not have things go his way. When he wanted something to happen, such a thing took place. And yet Hagrid was simply too useful, while the general disgust that him being a half-breed suscitated in Riddle could be reined in. Better half-giant or half-muggle? A small part of Tom wondered, before he almost violently cast away that thought, returning his razor-sharp focus on the cause of his turmoil. Rubeus took something as banal as the meanest principle of potion-making, and turned it into a whole philosophy that allowed the creation of a clearly magical brew out of mundane ingredients. Riddle followed the dark and damp corridor until it finally breached into a vast room. The only signal of its dimensions was the distant echo of the Slytherin steps and the fact that the white light he had summoned utterly failed to show any wall or ceiling. Here we are. There were many pieces of Hagrid's existence that didn't quite make sense, and many secrets that he kept to himself. Tom wasn't fooled by the sudden increase of notes about mind-boggling theories and outlandish ideas. Rubeus had likely been brooding them for much longer. How much of those were born of Minerva's studies? More than a few, unless Riddle completely missed his mark, and just what kind of things could he produce, had he access to this? The Slytherin prefect slashed his wand contemptuously, the white light he had summoned exploding in a quiet nova that seemed to adhere to the walls, revealing the bas-reliefs on the black and moss-green tiles, and the statues of hissing snakes that seemed to describe a corridor leading to the much bigger one of his own ancestor. Riddle had figured out his own ancestry during his first year, even if finding the fabled Chamber of Secrets had been that much harder, and while his research about Salazar's personality and life pointed towards the existence of priceless knowledge somewhere in the chamber, he had no idea how to access it. Revealing charms had proven useless, spells so powerful they would have breached a castle had rippled meaninglessly against uncaring black and green scales, almost taunting him. The memories of how Hagrid had behaved during the brewing of the Felix Felicis were just another proof of the half-giant inestimable talent. How much had Tom benefited from Rubeus' wild ideas and mind-boggling discoveries? And he achieved it all with no extraordinary ancestry beyond his mixed heritage. The questions and mutterings of the Slytherin prefect went unanswered in the daunting echo of the Chamber of Secrets, the statue of his ancestor mute as it had always been. Then again, it couldn't help Tom. Wasn't Salazar dead? How useful could a dead man be? He was gone, far before Riddle's advent, just like his mother, meaningless as she had undoubtedly been. I should have known not to expect an answer, should I? Tom's face lost his blank and polite facade for a moment, his lips curling downwards and a frown dragging his eyebrows down as if they were wings of a dangerous eagle. Once again, the yew and phoenix feather wand found itself into the Slytherin wizard's awaiting hand, his fingers curling avidly around the white wood. I made a question. He thundered while voiceless. Nameless magic whipped around Tom in a whirlwind of violence that screeched over the black and green tiles. You shall answer me. Twisted by his fury, his words turned into Parseltongue, hissing threateningly over the empty chamber, his aimless, violent display of magic making his own magical light quiver as if a candle in the hands of a merciless breeze. Suddenly, something gave, and the nearest snake statue broke under the strain of opposing the violence that Tom so readily had summoned. The sharp crack of shattered stone echoed violently about the chamber. Supporting the hiss that was still leaving Riddle's lips almost like a hand lifting a pebble from the ground. And with a grinding of stone on stone, the statue of Salazar Slytherin finally opened his mouth, a thundering hiss answering Tom's command. Chapter 41, Harry Potter, Chapter 41, Changes 2. Supporting the hiss that was still leaving Riddle's lips almost like a hand lifting a pebble from the ground. And with a grinding of stone on stone, the statue of Salazar Slytherin finally opened his mouth, a thundering hiss answering Tom's command. Miss McGonagall. The jovial voice of the deputy headmaster welcomed the Gryffindor witch's entrance into the room. I was surprised by your sudden request for a meeting. What troubles you? With the habit born of years of perfecting her transfiguration skills, Minerva let her eyes wander for a split second, taking in the environment and trying to memorize every detail while she distractedly answered, Professor, thank you for having me. The office of Albus Wulfric Percival Byron Dumbledore was a small rectangular study located off of the first-floor corridor, to the right of a staircase ascending directly to the third floor. A single, imposing desk dominated the whole space, illuminated by tall, leaded windows overlooking the training grounds and the Quidditch pitch, while against the walls on either side of the room there were tall shelves filled to the brim with books and uncountable knickknacks. Some were puffing, some were twirling, some looked like they just stopped moving, as if startled by Minerva's appearance in the Transfiguration Professor's office. In any case, there shouldn't be enough space on those shelves. The Gryffindor witch slowed down imperceptibly in her walk towards the desk at the end of the room, her focus zeroing in on the wooden bookshelves. Enlarging charms? Minerva had never heard of such a use for a spell meant for bags or tents, but if there was someone capable of adapting it, that would be Professor Dumbledore. She'd have to study that topic, maybe replicating the feat of the Transfiguration Professor on the stone bookshelves in the Runda. The Black King in one of her pockets dug briefly against her skin, as if purposefully reminding her that she was already ahead. I wonder what Rubeus will say about the doors once he sees them. On the left side of the room there was a large, lit fireplace, with a couple of armchairs and a small couch facing it. All in all, it was a cozy working space, and the jovial attitude of Dumbledore enhanced that trait. I'm here to help all students, Miss McGonagall. Dumbledore's voice brought her back to the reason for her visit. Please, take a seat. Even while offering her a place to sit in front of his desk, the professor made no move to summon a chair, nor to conjure one, and the eager smile he offered her was an invitation as good as any other. With no flourish, Minerva brought to bear her fur and dragon heartstring wand, her mind quieting down as she reached the calm awareness needed to adequately perform transfiguration. She was in her 6th year, and the NEWT level course had barely gotten over the vanishing of slugs, but in that subject, she felt neither fear nor embarrassment in recognizing herself as the very best. Immediately, Minerva discarded the memories of chairs she had seen in the course of her life, focusing instead on the very idea of a place where she'd want to sit. She was there to talk with Professor Dumbledore about what she had been able to perform, not to stay comfortable. Out of nowhere, a tall, straight-backed wooden chair took place in front of Dumbledore's desk, the grain of the wood smooth and dark to the point it almost gleamed black. With no hesitation and barely holding back a satisfied smirk, the Gryffindor witch sat in her conjured seat. How martial of you, Miss McGonagall. Dumbledore studied the high-backed wooden throne with undisguised interest, but very well done, as always. Take 10 points for Gryffindor. Almost jarringly, Minerva realized that she couldn't care less about house points. They had always been a part of her life at Hogwarts, a sign of how well she was performing and of how Gryffindor as a while fared against Hufflepuffs, Slytherins, and Ravenclaws. What do house point matter when Tom, Rubeus, and I have realized all of those things? She had become an animagus. Why would she still care about something as useless as house points? There were more important things, such as the reason she had asked to meet with Dumbledore as soon as she left the Runda after her almost uncontrolled display of transfiguration. Carefully avoiding any mention about the Runda, any reference to the presence of other people, or even to think about the location where the event had taken place, she described what she had done to the door, from the first change into resin to the rest of the changes that the wood had endured, and perhaps thrived in. Link after link, she described the chain of transfigurations that had taken place, offering her limited understanding of what she had been capable of doing while openly asking for an explanation. She had studied transfiguration with almost religious focus since day one, and she had never heard anything of the sort. Dumbledore hummed thoughtfully for a few seconds, immediately noticing the lack of details about where this door was, but deeming the witch's reticence as something she'd either shed on her own, or not. Hogwarts was a big place, with many decorates. If no whispers of such an extraordinary door made their way into the rumor mill, that would prove that Minerva had simply decided to explore a bit. "You have an instinct about transfiguration that I've rarely seen," the comment of the professor made her eyes widen with barely concealed appreciation. "What truly held you back was a too rigid control over everything involved with this branch of magic, from the images you want to reshape reality into, to the utter lack of emotional investment in your creations." "What?" The voice of the Gryffindor witch was almost strangled when she asked for clarification, but I let my focus waver. Emotions shouldn't overcome the focus of transfiguration. What I say to all the first years is true: we bring into reality shades of ideal forms that could never be in this gritty world of ours. The tone of the professor became as animated as it always was when facing an interesting topic with an attentive student. There was a world-shaking joy in teaching that nothing would ever manage to march. But our emotions, our hopes and dreams, those make each one of us unique, and that uniqueness is fundamental in giving strength to shapes that would otherwise remain as shades of something more. Minerva had spent all her years of education with a steely control over her own emotions and thoughts, finding that they interfered with the learning process of new spells, and now she was being told that emotions had to be somewhat channeled into the magic? That was preposterous. Now, Dumbledore rose from his seat behind his desk and walked around, his lively blue eyes shining with pride. "That is not to say that we should let our fleeting thoughts interfere with a transfiguration, but our experiences are the only thing that can deepen an individual's understanding, and deeper our understanding, better defined are the ideal forms we can call to." A heavy frown etched itself on Minerva's features as she lifted herself from her conjured chair. "I still don't understand what I've done." "Then you'll only have to practice, won't you?" The deputy headmaster gently pointed at one of the armchairs sitting in front of the fireplace. "I'd like you to perform another chain transfiguration of that piece of furniture. For now, we won't care about the final result, but eventually, I expect you'll be able to direct the turning point of the change into something that turns the target of your magic into a better version of itself. Like using clouds to make an armchair softer and cool." The wonder in Minerva's voice clearly showed just how much she was enthralled by the topic, and Dumbledore's smile grew in seeing someone else with such a pure love for his favorite subject. "I would have never thought about that," the old wizard laughed merrily. "Why don't you show me?" With a bit of trepidation, the Gryffindor witch readied herself to seek that strange balance point between steely control and the unmatched creative freedom that rampaging emotions could deliver. "The more I think about this, the harder it sounds." She hesitated for an instant, but only long enough for her free hand to pat the pocket in which the Black King Tom gave her was resting. She wouldn't hold back, and she wouldn't stop improving. She couldn't allow the two Slytherin wizards to leave her behind. Chapter 42, Harry Potter, Chapter 42, Turning Point. I was sitting on a transfigured bench in a hidden, underground chamber that I had dug under the cellar of Marie and Paul's home, staring aimlessly at the silver-lined cages that isolated the two Muggleborns I had saved. "We're almost there," I warned the duo, receiving a distasteful, heavy frown from the man and a grimace that should have been a smile from the woman. The room was scarcely illuminated by a few vials containing one of my brews of sunlight. I was trying to discern if that was capable of influencing, even minimally, the imminent werewolf transformation. Since the first summer I had ventured out into the wider world, along with my constant and never-ending experimentation with potions, my ever-increasing number of projects, and the busy task of filtering the notes that I made available in the Runda, I had been trying to figure out lycanthropy. Of course, general information on that was easy enough to come by, and the restricted section had a number of tomes listing the disastrous failures to either restrain, isolate, or control werewolves made before my time. I had devoured that knowledge, framing the concepts and ideas into my personal understanding of how magic in general worked. Even my knowledge of the Animagus transformation wasn't too big of a help. Several pieces, from the ritualism to the lightning storm necessary to complete that piece of magic, acted as a controlling element for the wild implicit in turning into an animal, an element that was partially summoned through the dew untouched by the human hand. Too much of the process Minerva had undergone was keyed into obtaining a final result with control as a fundamental element, and the moth chrysalis, besides being employed to act as a turning point for the transformation, was also an element that symbolized the natural progression of the insect's life. The Animagus transformation, with that in mind, was a part of the wizard, not something separate. Those multitude of differences were enough to leave me high and dry when it came to applying my knowledge to the curse that was lycanthropy. Not to mention the utter insanity of a piece of magic capable of transmitting itself by bite of all things. With what I knew, as soon as I had been able to, I had built 2 silver-lined cages to keep Marie and Paul contained when the full moon came knocking. The specifications matched in almost every tome that I had been able to study, and between the room of requirement, the rich first-year purebloods that came to Hogwarts with a pure silver cauldron and was then too scared to ask his parents for another, I had been able to obtain the pricey material. Of course, I had also tried again and again the very first recipe I had used to close the 2 muggles' wounds, exploring just how strong I could make the effects of a potion focused on a mirrored moon, refining the process and applying it to other brews, and outright remaking several potions part of Hogwarts' curriculum with different ingredients altogether. I'm not going to share this with Slughorn in any case. The man had already proved how casual he could be in stealing the rough ideas of his students, and I wasn't eager for a repeat. The Wolfsbane potion was something that had yet to be invented, but I couldn't exactly sit around till the end of the 70s, leaving Paul and Marie to tear through the Forest of Dean during each full moon would spell disaster in the long term. In line with the first vague statement of Slughorn that stated a potion is like a story, it was indeed possible to achieve different brews that did the same things. Applying that to my line of research for a cure, meant that I could carry on 2 separate lines of development and discovery. It didn't quite double my chances of succeeding, but each failure offered me new insight into the curse. The potion in Marie's hand leveraged the mirroring effect I was slowly discovering, while the one for Paul had been realized with an application of the knowledge I had derived from studying Polyjuice and the standard Animagus transformation. Taking a glance at the clock I had placed on one of the walls, I spoke, "Drink them now." The 2 shared a fortifying breath before downing the vial I had prepared for each of them. Of course, I had changed the outside color of the glass so that it'd be opaque. I really didn't need either of the 2 to start questioning why one was of a deep burgundy and the other of a murky white. An instant later, I summoned to me the 2 vials and twirled my wand in my fingers, the familiar warmth and thrumming, silent power making me smile fondly as I pointed the length of holly and phoenix feather at myself, my mind shifting to a concept I had grown increasingly familiar with since my first and only ritual. Shadows were a powerful idea, cast by something as powerful as light, they were ever present, and behaved mercurially in answer to the changes to the position of light sources. Shadows swam with a speed that matched the movement of the sun, the moon, the stars, and even the meanest torch or bonfire. And just as the light dispelled illusions, as I had observed by casually using liquid dawnbreak to find Ravenclaw's diadem, the shadows concealed. Just like the shadows cast at twilight on my ritual had concealed my home, birthing a tree that I was still too wary and guilty to study. Eyes turned into crystal-like orbs that shattered into black smoke without spilling a single drop of blood. A tearing sound of ripped flesh thundered in my ears as roots pierced from my father's body. "I need a drink." I shook my head, forcing myself back into the present while I held onto the awareness of shadows that I could barely grasp. Abdomi. With improvised Latin lending the needed gravitas to my will, I dragged my wand in a vertical line in front of me, smoky shadows following the tip of Hollywood in a rippling, wavy pattern. The liquid-like substance hovered in front of me for a couple of seconds, only to fall over my form with a sound of silk on silk, uncharacteristically warm as it settled over my skin. From one moment to the next, I vanished into the shadows of the dimly lit room, the sunset brewed light close enough to twilight that my spell was almost enhanced by that. I followed with the same sequence of spells that had concealed me in Albania, when I happened so close to vampires that only liquid luck stopped me from outright tripping over them. As soon as the last silencing charm fell on my form, the moon outside finished rising, and the transformation began. There was a terrible snarling noise, followed by a keening wail that managed to send a shiver down my spine. Paul and Marie's heads were lengthening. So were bodies, and soon the transfigured clothes they were wearing sizzled and fell apart, unable to sustain the presence of the werewolves. Their shoulders grew hunched, while fuzz started to grow out of their skin, covering the inhuman features they now sported. Their limbs assumed a new configuration with the snapping of bone and the almost audible tearing of muscles. Hands and feet cured into black clawed paws, which dug small furrows into the floor of the cages the werewolves were standing in. I forced myself to watch like I had done so many times before, in perfect stillness, as understanding and humanity fled the 2 French muggles, leaving behind the inhuman need to tear, bite, and howl. But, for the first time in the dozen or so attempts, my unerring focus was paid itself by spotting something. There was a difference between the 2 werewolves. Paul seemed more restrained, as even at the peak of his change, he remained hunched, his head shaking minutely as spasms kept running through his body. The brew I had developed for him was based on what little I knew from the Wolf's Bane potion that would one day come into being. What I had attempted to do, was to surrender the change of the body to the moon's effect, focusing instead all the power that I could squeeze into the potion on the mind. I had employed the swooping evil's secretions that I more or less stole from Slughorn's reserves to target the wolf. Paul's potion was meant to target exclusively the wolf's mind, if a distinction could be made, and to more or less obviate the wild need for violence that characterized the werewolf. I really need to study the shadow tree that hides my home. Maybe the leaves can be leveraged to hide the beast from the body, leaving control to Paul. I swallowed hollowly at the reminder that I still knew almost nothing about what I had accomplished with the metamorphosis of Hagrid's dying father, once more casting the thought aside in order to focus on the here and now. While Marie's form howled to the ceiling without purpose, as it usually did, something in Paul was fighting the change. That creature was spasming, hunched on all fours while its head rolled aimlessly, snarling furiously as it stumbled. As if a string under too much strain, Paul suddenly snapped, and a ripple of primal fury could be heard in the haunting howl that followed. Whatever opposition my brew had managed to muster against the change, it shattered helplessly against the sheer power of the moon-empowered curse. Paul's golden eyes flashed hungrily then, the inhuman mind behind them analyzing the rest of the chamber until the beast's orbs landed on the shadows cloaking me. And in a way that I wasn't equipped to justify, never mind understand, the werewolf spotted me. There was no transition. One moment it was still after its last challenging howl, the next it flung itself towards me, slamming against the silver-lined cage that burned fiercely against its skin. An almost thunderous snarl followed, and the beast started to mindlessly ram against it again and again, while Marie remained surprisingly controlled, given her conditions. Her inhuman eyes observed what her fellow werewolf was trying to accomplish, but there was no understanding in her behavior, only the distracted curiosity of an animal that didn't feel under threat when a bigger beast had a clear target. Paul rammed itself once more against the bars, uncaring of the pain that only managed to make the werewolf more furious, and it raked its claws helplessly against the unyielding silver. A chunk of his fur sizzled, while a bunch of hair managed to fall through the bars, and quick as a viper, I summoned those to me, safely tucking them into one of the crystal vials I always carried with me. Luckily enough, the insane magic resistance of the werewolf didn't translate to the mere hairs that he shed. Hopefully, I'd be able to use them either as ingredients or as a clue to deepen my knowledge of the curse, even if I doubted it. Besides, if I needed werewolf's hair to brew a cure, that would severely limit my ability to brew it in the first place. Another failure. My eyes lingered on both the werewolves for a few seconds, my heart thundering with no control in my chest even if I should have been used to this shit by now. Before Paul managed to kill himself against the cage tailor-made for werewolves, I operated away, leaving behind the hidden cellar and the Forest of Dean. Chapter 43, Harry Potter, Chapter 43, Turning Point 2. Another failure. My eyes lingered on both the werewolves for a few seconds, my heart thundering with no control in my chest even if I should have been used to this shit by now. Before Paul managed to kill himself against the cage tailor-made for werewolves, I operated away, leaving behind the hidden cellar and the Forest of Dean. I appeared with a sharp crack into a familiar clearing, and I didn't hesitate in casting once more the veritable hail of concealing charms over myself, my long legs already taking me through the forbidden forest at a pace that no ordinary human could follow for more than a couple of minutes. I followed the beginnings of a trail that my frequent excursions were starting to shape into the otherwise untraveled ground. There was a visible effect in both cases this time. I reasoned even while I kept my senses peeled to catch anything untoward happening in my immediate surroundings. Marie had looked more restrained, and there had been a noticeable hitch in the final stages of Paul's transformation. Of course, then the werewolf managed to spot me despite the concealing spells I had been using for years now, and that was another problem. I need ingredients tailored for this potion in particular, but unless the leaves of the shadow tree prove themselves miraculous, they won't be enough for a whole cure. A ritual? Dangerous stuff that, and I have no idea how to make Marie execute one, that isn't something I can prepare in their stead. I walked over a root that reached my shin and ducked under a branch that I could have sworn wasn't there a moment before, but it didn't change my pace. In my experience, the beings in the forest left you alone as long as you did the same, and the full moon generally made the regular inhabitants of the forbidden forest more weary than aggressive. Marie looked calmer, while Paul visibly struggled with the change. Now that I managed to obtain two effects, I simply needed to isolate the reason for the change. Hoping that their sex doesn't influence the effect of the potion, but that shouldn't be an issue. The potion I had given to Paul apparently lacked enough power to oppose the change, while the one drank by Marie seemed to lack direction. I had carefully avoided the use of dragon's blood in either of the brews, knowing that while it conferred a great deal of power, it was also a substance difficult to direct towards an end result that I needed to be peaceful. Dragons, beyond any other being, were synonyms with power, a power that wasn't meant to be restrained. Maybe I should research them some more, but without direct experience, I cannot truly divine what I'd be able to do with their parts as ingredients. I need power. I abandoned my budding trail in order to pick up a couple of purple-black flowers that seemed to shine silver in the corner of my eye, only to walk crouched for a couple of meters as I ripped some brownish-red moss from a rock, each ingredient finding a place in the many pockets or vials present on my person. If only I could use the lightning storm for the Animagus process too. I stilled as I returned on the beaten path, but I can, can't I? If I managed to capture Dawnbreak, what's to say I cannot capture a cyclone? Order and power, in a single vial. Or I need to figure out crossbreeding and lead a project to give me the ingredients with the exact properties I need, but that'd take years. Maybe this is the solution, at least for Paul. I returned to my musings while I kept picking any ingredient that didn't require me to face off with something sentient and that kept me in sight of the trail I was making with my frequent escapades in the Forbidden Forest. But what direction can I give to a werewolf in order to keep Marie from rampaging? Once I was done ranting and raving and rambling in my head, I stole a glance at the full moon, and realized that it was low enough that my absence had likely gone unnoticed. Only as I started to cross from the edge of the Forbidden Forest onto the Hogwarts grounds, did I remember that tonight I'd have to make my first appearance at the Slug Club. A disgusted groan tore itself from me while I moved towards the castle, my pace quickening ever so slightly. I disliked the idea of the brown-nosing involved, but Slughorn had been far more than merely useful, and snubbing him would bite me in the ass, especially since I was sure that he knew of my easy-come, easy-go attitude in regards to Hogwarts. At least I could get drunk, and at the moment, I frankly wanted nothing more. Shower first, I'll think about the rest later. So I snuck into the castle with the expertise born of endless repetition and made my way to the Slytherin common room, dismissing without a second thought the whispers that followed me and my unnaturalness in order to take a quick shower, and change into something more appropriate for Sluggy's party. And realizing that I'd likely see little use for the werewolf hair I had picked up from Paul, at least given the direction I just decided to take the development of my brews in, I tucked the vial into an inner pocket of my robes, quickly making my way to the Slug Club. Slughorn's party was as classy as a group of gifted teenage students mingling with a professor and his guests could be. Thank the gods I'm terribly late. The large room had been organized with tables arrayed against the walls holding delicacies of any sort, while less than extraordinary students still hoping to score a few brownie points were acting as waiters here and there, pouring wine and whatnot. Soft chamber music ran delicately in the underground, chorusing nicely with the low murmuring of the lit fireplaces. Ignoring the few visibly tipsy teenagers that were slowly making their way out of the Slug Club, I spotted a group counting no less than 10 heads entertaining conversation around Slughorn himself, who was giving me his back for the time being. Of course, I spotted Tom's charming smile from across the room, and from the set of the other students' shoulders, I could tell they were hanging from his lips. He's in full charming mode then. You're late. Minerva ambushed me just as I made a note of steering clear of Riddle, as I wasn't about to ruin his little games as long as he did no harm, but I also was unwilling to bear pointless chatter. As she often favored, the witch wore an emerald green velvety ensemble, that however managed to nod to her Gryffindor nature with an elegant measure of golden thread poking through here and there. I didn't bother containing my grin, finally starting to feel the tension of the evening recede. A wizard is neither early nor late, he. Spare me. She interrupted me, knowing already one of my favorite quotes yet to become deservingly famous. You missed dinner, and most of the party. The witch sniffed disdainfully at me. Many people have already gone away, I'll have you know. Anyone interesting? I replied easily while I started to casually eat and drink, distractedly appreciating the quality of the food. Hunger is still the best seasoning. Not particularly, no. The Gryffindor witch didn't bother with hiding her exasperated sigh. And you haven't been in the Runda recently, have you? I enlarged one of the available delicate-looking chalices and unashamedly poured more than half of a bottle of white wine into it, sipping it with a satisfied sigh, its chill helping washing away the heated moments in which I had forced myself to remain still less than 3 meters from 2 werewolves. I've been busy recently, why? Has something happened? Oh, I wouldn't want to spoil the surprise. She grinned almost impishly then, but we'll go together next time. I want to see your face when you see the changes I've wrought. I didn't bother disguising my interest. For all of the average Gryffindor's love for fame and whatnot, Minerva wasn't one to toot her own horn. She preferred to remark "I told you so" after a fact, but she felt that praising herself was beneath her. My eyes wandered freely for the slowly emptying Slug Club, only for my attention to fall again and again on the group of people surrounding Riddle. "Oh, those are all members of the dueling club," Minerva spoke when she noted where my focus was. "I don't know why Tom is chatting with them though. I don't think he's joined them yet." Riddle isn't much of a joiner. Hogwarts actually has a dueling club. Has anyone mentioned that you are curiously ignorant of what happens around you? She rounded on me without bothering disguising how hilarious she found me. As I recall it, yes, Minerva, you do. I huffed in faux irritation, rather often, in my opinion. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong. Rubeus. Slughorn's typically jolly voice made me turn in the direction of the portly wizard, who had approached us while I was busy eating and drinking, my mind trying to figure out what my friend might have accomplished in the past days. "Professor." I greeted him with a nod, finishing my first glass of wine and unashamedly pouring myself another. The portly wizard shook a finger in my direction almost threateningly. "I thought you would simply ignore my invite, my boy. What held you back?" "Trying out untested potions on powerless muggles, for their own good, of course. Potions don't wait for anyone, Professor." I grinned. Brewing under certain phases of the moon is singularly stimulating. The head of House Slytherin sighed then, spotting the paper-thin excuse for what it was, but he allowed me to get away with my bullshit, a part of him still eager to see what kind of new marvel I'd eventually come up with. "Well, since you're here, I wanted to introduce you to a student. He's a shoo-in for Slytherin prefect next year." My eyes scanned the room, spotting a dark-haired kid walking in our direction, his deep blue eyes obviously fixed on me. "Oh. Orion Black is a year ahead of you, and he could use some support when it comes to the delicate art of potion making." Slughorn's voice turned serious then. "He'll be the future Lord Black, and a useful friend to have, if you play your cards right." Did I hear that name before? I barely withheld a sigh. Isn't it enough that I pretend to care for your slug club? Now I have to cater to the needs of a kid that apparently is unable to follow a simple recipe? How can someone manage to not pass potions? Following the recipe to the letter is enough for an acceptable, isn't it? My head of house shot me a reproaching glare then, shifting his attention to Minerva, whose expression clearly manifested just how much she wanted me to shut up. "I heard he's very good at charms. Professor Farsi mentioned he wanted him to get started on the new charm course despite his being a fourth-year student." My eyebrows climbed into my hairline at the witch's words. "So he isn't an incapable idiot, he simply has difficulties with how potions is framed as a subject." Unfortunately, my voice wasn't quite adequate for polite whispering, and the newcomer heard everything I just said. "I am most certainly not an idiot, no." Chapter 44, Harry Potter, Chapter 44, Turning Point 3. My eyebrows climbed into my hairline at the witch's words. "So he isn't an incapable idiot, he simply has difficulties with how potions is framed as a subject." Unfortunately, my voice wasn't quite adequate for polite whispering, and the newcomer heard everything I just said. "I am most certainly not an idiot, no." Orion Black was a capable wizard, an heir to the most ancient and noble house of Black, incredibly politically savvy for someone his age. He had inherited a stark pragmatism that would one day make him perfect for the role he'd eventually inherit. The adherence to Slytherin's favored traits was expected of him, and something that Orion took a graceful measure of pride into. That was the reason why he had needed to twist his genuine enjoyment of charms into a passion for warding, something that he could excuse to the rest of the family as a wish to make their home unassailable. Having difficulties in a subject before he took his owls, however, was not something he could allow. Knowing oneself was fundamental for a wizard for a number of reasons, and so Orion kept up his soul-searching while he walked up to the student Slughorn had meant to introduce him to, easily recognizing him. After all, he had been already 2 meters tall back in his first year, and the boy had kept growing. "I am most certainly not an idiot, no." Orion's voice announced his presence to the unnaturally tall Slytherin, who didn't have the decency of looking abashed. "I am Rubeus Hagrid." The deep baritone of the tired-looking third-year Slytherin was out of place on such a young wizard, and yet, it matched his incongruous size perfectly. Orion barely held back a sneer. "I know." The Gryffindor witch that so often accompanied herself with the Slytherin student in question introduced herself, and the heir of House Black smoothly exchanged meaningless platitudes with her and the potions professor both, only to frown in distaste and return his attention to the unnaturally tall Slytherin student, which had been looking at him with something that looked like Disappointment? How? Hagrid asked, clarifying once Orion raised an unimpressed eyebrow. How do you know my name? Black sighed inwardly, his thoughts scheming over his own circumstances while he tried to keep back the insults that bubbled to the forefront of his mind. Excellence in every endeavor he undertook was a trait that he couldn't forfeit. The lesser branches of the family expected just a sign of weakness in order to pounce and take his rightful inheritance of lordship from him. Of course, Cygnus, born in 1938, would be raised ready to take over the BLCK family in case something happened, while it was up to Orion to make sure his little brother both knew his place and didn't resent him for being the lord. Competition bred excellence, in a way. That was why the founders divided the wards of Hogwarts into houses. And if the Lord Blacktby wasn't able to handle his closest relations, well, then it was simply luck that there were other options, wasn't it? So, Orion had grown up constantly challenged, learning how to play to his strengths while concealing his weaknesses, and now that he was in his 4th year, he could start to look outwards himself in order to build a power that, while not magical, could prove itself endlessly beneficial. Has it escaped your attention that we belong to the same house? Orion Black didn't bother hiding his sarcasm, no matter what Slughorn had told him about this unnaturally sized wizard. For now, he made a perfect impression of a particularly dim-witted troll. Orion would one day be more than a simply competent wizard, and more than a mere member of the Wisengamot. For that, he'd need allies in as many positions as he could afford, reeling in their support when needed, while offering some form of compensation that would make those people both eager for more and scared of reprisals. Such was the might of the House of Black. That need meshed wonderfully with Orion's acceptable in potions. He needed to bring it up to and exceed expectations before the end of the year, or he wouldn't be a prefect, which meant fewer opportunities to network with those that one day he'd need as allies. At the same time, the shunned, unnaturally tall half-blood was singularly talented in potion-making while lacking anything resembling a connection to society. For all of his jovial attitude, Slughorn was a consummated Slytherin, and recognized an opportunity when he spotted one. By virtue of introducing the two, he'd gained some measure of gratitude from both. It hasn't, no. The much taller Slytherin studied Orion with unnerving focus, his dark eyes roaming over his form with barely hidden amusement. You're surprisingly controlled for someone so little. Black spluttered, his focus and half-conscious meditation disrupted by the non-sequitur. And I worried about pointing out his freakishness. Orion opened his mouth to put in his place the tall Slytherin student, when he caught it, expectation. He had been subjected to far too many hidden tests in his life, from far too many people, to not recognize a challenge when he was subjected to one. Does he want to see how I'll react? Before he could reply, however, the 3rd-year Slytherin kept talking, turning towards their head of house, which was almost glaring at the unnaturally sized wizard. We'll figure something out that is beneficial to both, Professor. Thank you for introducing us. Oh, well, Slughorn produced his standard soft laugh, something that sent his double chin wobbling minutely. If you must thank me, I'll have you know that I have a favorite suite. Orion tuned out the downplaying of Horace's networking skills, his focus returning to the unnaturally tall student that proceeded to down another couple of adequately sized glasses of wine, and a third once their head of house's improvised speech kept going. Well, I'm not one for purchasing gifts, Professor. McGonagall reminded everyone of her presence then. You brewed a new one. A new what? Black frowned in distaste at being cut off from the conversation, but he immediately plastered a relaxed expression over his features. He knew how to conduct a verbal exchange, and it wasn't the time to steer his interlocutors to a new topic. Not when the unnaturally tall Slytherin extracted a single vial from one of his inner pockets, a vial containing a lump of grey fur. Not quite. The grin on Rubeus' face was just too wide to come off as not threatening, but Slughorn accepted the vial with undisguised curiosity, his eyes not managing to spot the flash of something on the younger student's face. By Merlin's. Horace's voice went out then while he held the vial up against the light given by a crystal lamp. Is this truly freshly picked too? The deep chuckle of the too tall Slytherin student made Orion's ribcage rumble uncomfortably for a second. I have no idea what to do with it, but I also wanted to have a unique thank you for the many opportunities that you offered me thus far, Professor. The vial disappeared into the deep pockets of Slughorn almost faster than Orion could see, and the professor exchanged a sly glance with the 3rd-year student, before taking in the quickly emptying room. Oh, well, since it's just us. He started walking toward one end of the room, immediately followed by both Minerva and Rubeus. You mentioned Bruce. Orion smoothly inserted himself into the conversation while he took notice that the cohort of fools catering to Riddle had decided to leave. McGonagall's cheeks reddened minutely as she blinked in his direction, blatantly letting him know that she had forgotten about his presence, and she exchanged a glance with the much taller Slytherin student, which merely patted her gently on the back. "Oh, it's sort of an open secret among a selected few." Hagrid's baritone addressed Orion's question before the latter could pounce on the Gryffindor's faux pas. "I have no doubts Dumbledore knows, it's hard to get something done under his nose, after all, but since it's not malignant in the least, he generally lets it go. I'm quite spectacular with potions, and beverages like fire whiskey, gilly water, and so on seemed subpar, so he turned an abandoned classroom into a brewery." The smooth voice of Tom Riddle was good support to his soft smile as he joined the small group following Slughorn, which was now directed to a cabinet that Orion had missed up to that point. "It's merely a place where I study potions." Hagrid shook his head, enjoying the outrageous nature of the paper-thin difference. "If some of those concoctions have effects that can be described as entertaining, well, that's still something new I've learned about." Chapter 45, Harry Potter, Chapter 45, Turning Point 4. "It's merely a place where I study potions." Hagrid shook his head, enjoying the outrageous nature of the paper-thin difference. "If some of those concoctions have effects that can be described as entertaining, well, that's still something new I've learned about." The four students followed Slughorn while Orion frowned at the easy camaraderie present among McGonagall, Riddle, and Hagrid. He knew something about their academic results. After all, Hogwarts was only so big, but he wouldn't have imagined that the three were acquainted, never mind friends. Just how had they got to know each other? Surely it wasn't Slughorn's work. Rubeus was barely old enough to make an appearance in the Slug Club, and neither Quidditch nor any other study-related club had any of the three as a member. Orion made it his business to know students that could eventually become particularly useful in any given field. And while Riddle's exceptional wand work and outstanding marks were just barely less known than Minerva's success in Transfiguration, even Hagrid's gift for potions wasn't enough to offer an answer to the relaxed friendship that the Black-Heir could clearly see. Slughorn silently led them through a door and into his private quarters, where he stopped next to a cabinet placed a few steps from a lit fireplace. The small living room still presented the refined taste of a Slytherin, but where the room hosting the events for the Slug Club was defined by its elegance, the new space Orion found himself in was heavily leaning towards comfort as its main purpose. Thick carpets, dainty poufs were paired with plush armchairs, and small couches were placed strategically in order to allow many comfortable places where a wizard could simply relax reading a book or nursing a pick-me-up. The light of the full moon entered through a narrow and tall window at such an angle that it refracted against a crystal chandelier floating just under the ceiling, and the contrast between the distant astral body and the warming lit fireplace painted the whole room with a quality that could only be defined as ethereal. "Well, I might have been on the receiving end of some of Rubeus' most successful attempts," Professor Slughorn openly confessed as he opened the liquor cabinet. "Luckily, some of these are as light as butterbeer, while being much more interesting, and conductive to much more refined conversations. What would you suggest, my boy?" Hagrid lumbered next to the fireplace and silently enlarged one of the armchairs. "After a night like this I'll go with a generous serving of new sickle." Orion blinked in open surprise at how accommodating Slughorn was being, but following the budding talent for politics that his parents didn't neglect nurturing, he simply rolled with the punches. He sat next to Riddle on a low couch in front of a glass coffee table and accepted the potion professor's suggestion when it came to choosing a beverage. Minerva proceeded to quietly wave her wand, conjuring a couple of matching armchairs for herself and the professor, who, always the consumed and graceful host, arranged the seating so that the small group of Slytherin wizards plus Gryffindor which described a misshapen half-circle around the table, leaving the lit fireplace on one side. Orion didn't bother to hide his appreciation of the witch's skill. "I don't need to be in a nude course of transfiguration to know how remarkable that is." Slughorn sank into the armchair with a deep, satisfied sigh that temporarily ballooned out his already prominent belly. "I see why Albus is always so eager to praise you, dear Minerva. This is truly advanced transfiguration." Turning his attention to the other wizards, the potion master smiled openly. "A profane of the art might think that she conjured armchairs and then enchanted them, but that isn't quite what you did, is it?" Hagrid placed on the coffee table the tall glass containing a silvery liquid that Slughorn had provided him with, not bothering at all with disguising his interest. "Anything to with the surprise you mentioned." Orion consciously stopped himself from letting his jaw hang open in surprise as the Gryffindor witch proceeded to excitedly explain what some of her last Dumbledore-sanctioned experiments with transfiguration were about. the reasoning and the examples largely going above the Black Heir's understanding of the subject. Is she saying what I think she is? Basically, you transfigured some of the light from the fireplace into comfort while you were conjuring the armchairs. Hagrid's open curiosity spared Orion the small humiliation of having to ask for clarification, and McGonagall's self-satisfied smirk was answer enough. How far can you stretch an ideal to generate a contradictory shape? Riddle's smooth voice reminded Orion of his presence, while Slughorn appeared happy to let the exchange play out. Arguably, even Hagrid could brew a poison with daisies as main ingredient, but it wouldn't be terribly powerful, I think. It wouldn't. The potion teacher cut in before the unnaturally tall Slytherin could zero in on the dubious nature of the even uttered by the Slytherin perfect. Working with an ingredient's nature is what makes potions more refined than, let's say, enchanting a mirror so that it could act as a knife. McGonagall sipped from her beverage for a couple of seconds before answering, nursing her words with care as she tried to simplify a concept that she understood almost instinctively. Usually, the shape follows the function. There are cross-transfigurations that... She sighed, looking for the words that for the moment escaped her. I believe Albus once produced a lion out of a decent-sized rock. Slughorn came to aid the witch. The construct was clearly an animation of a transfigured, inanimate object, and yet it was lively while retaining the unyielding properties of the stone. Ah! Hagrid nodded slowly, his eyes slightly unfocused as he parsed what he had been told, while Riddle seemed to find confirmation of an idea he already had. This is a far-reaching implication of a more or less simple concept. Orion thought idly, having gotten the gist of what the Gryffindor witch had attempted to explain, only to return his focus to the interlocutors Slughorn had organized for him to meet with. The witch was a half-blood with no connections whatsoever, but so talented as to achieve the status of Animagus before her owls. The freakishly tall, younger Slytherin was much the same only in regards to potions, only he was further burdened by the engorging brew that caused his eye-catching size. In the end, there was Tom Riddle, poor as they came, but undeniably bright. Purpose is derived through the symbol you need to perform any piece of magic. Orion spoke idly, fishing some obscure nugget of knowledge in order to make clear that he wasn't academically less capable than the other people present. The most powerful application of a Fidelius, for example, can, in theory, be achieved only when cast upon a place lacking any other form of defense. That's a very rare charm. Praised Slughorn, a greedy glint in his eyes, and not something that many of your age can hope to understand the intricacies of. Not something that anyone researches for the sake of research, to be honest. I wonder, might you be thinking about using it upon one of your family's properties? I heard that Lord Black recently purchased a townhouse in London. Not likely, not when I have the might of Black wards to rely upon. Perhaps. Orion contented himself with smiling mysteriously, his eyes temporarily washing over the other three underage people present, finding that they were already looking at him with newfound respect. It's too easy to get in the graces of the academically inclined. Almost like misshapen reflections, the other two Slytherin students took a gulp from their respective beverages, their eyes meeting each other over the brim of their chalices. The Black Heir didn't miss the brief but somewhat heavy stare that Riddle and Hagrid exchanged before the latter outright asked, turning his shoulders fully towards Orion. I didn't have the time to study it in depth yet, but how does the passing of the secret work? And how does the Keeper maintain it safe? Occlumency. Just who is this Hagrid to mention the mind arts so casually? The Keeper must be wanting to reveal the secret. The Black Heir replied with a frown, barely controlling his knee-jerk reaction while a part of him searched his memories. The tome I've learned this from didn't specify further. Occlumency. The Gryffindor witch asked as she finished her drink, placing the empty glass on the coffee table. That'd be because the secret is concealed within the soul of the Keeper. Slughorn smiled widely at his students while he ignored Minerva's immediate question, before his expression became somewhat more sheepish. I'm a purveyor of the esoteric, very much like you appear to be, Rubeus, just where have you heard of the mind arts? The unnaturally tall student smiled guilelessly at the potion professor while he rolled his humongous shoulders. I seem to have forgotten all about that, but while we are on this topic, just how is the mid related to the soul? Ah, you don't ask small questions, do you? Slughorn openly laughed, his belly quivering while he leaned back in the conjured armchair. We think, so we have a mind, we move, so we have a body, we cast spells, so we have magic, and we can leave ghosts behind, so we have a soul. But defining the soul, that's not something that has been achieved yet, I think. I read that the mind exerts will, the body has strength, magic holds power, and that the soul is a reflection of them all. A curious way to put it. Slughorn's eyes widened with undisguised interest. But not an incorrect one, I think. There have been instances that might support such a fuzzy definition. Alas, this matters hardly lend themselves to clear boundaries. It is one of the beauties of potion making, I believe. To answer your question, Miss McGonagall, occlumency is one of the two branches of the mind arts. Blatantly changing topic, the head of House Slytherin returned his focus to the Gryffindor witch, which smiled gratefully now that her blurted-out question was being addressed. In particular, occlumency deals with the magical defense of the mind against external penetration. An obscure branch of magic, but a highly useful one. Ever bright, Minerva didn't take long to catch the implications. You mean that some people could just read my mind? And why isn't occlumency taught at Hogwarts? Minerva didn't bother hiding her frown. I'd think that such a skill should be made available to any wishing for it. Yes, I wonder why the existence of a way to keep your thoughts concealed might be kept under wraps. Hagrid's rumbling chuckle just oozed sarcasm. Perhaps you could ask Professor Dumbledore to teach you. I bet he's frightfully good at it, with a brain like his. More importantly, I wonder if there is a way to make use of your animagus to help you along the way. Who the hell thinks like this? Orion arched an eyebrow in the direction of the unnaturally tall Slytherin student, who leaned back in his seat as an answer, his open smile the only answer he was willing to give to the Black Heir's silent question, while McGonagall's expression clearly stated that the idea caught her interest. Chapter 46, Harry Potter, Chapter 46, Turning Point V. Who the hell thinks like this? Orion arched an eyebrow in the direction of the unnaturally tall Slytherin student, who leaned back in his seat as an answer, his open smile the only answer he was willing to give to the Black Heir's silent question, while McGonagall's expression clearly stated that the idea caught her interest. Slughorn coughed, trying to bring the conversation back on a more pleasurable track. To answer your question, dear Minerva, some of the ministry jobs would become much more difficult if occlumency was a widely spread practice. And there isn't a way to actually verify is a wizard is better than the attacker in the mind arts or merely average. The most basic step of occlumency is about not giving anything to your attacker, but a master of the art could do much more. Orion added, his expression carefully blank while he tried to come to terms with the endless list of oddities that characterized the three students Slughorn had used the evening to introduce to the Black Heir. It's one of the reasons why neither memories seen in a pensieve nor veritaserum are allowed in court. Much more such as. Riddle idly crossed his legs while maintaining his usual, polite tone, but the Black Heir was starting to believe that the older student was simply used to keep his natural reactions concealed, and that he was, in fact, very curious about the answer. A truly masterful application of occlumency would allow the user to conceal his thoughts even to himself, to the point of fabricating memories. Slughorn was happy to explain, his eyes showing a brief spark of excitement that was hard to miss. It's incredibly useful to cast spells that require a particular mindset, not to mention that as you learn it you acquire a self-discipline that is hard to acquire otherwise. The thoughtful, deep hum of Hagrid made Orion's breastbone resonate for a split second. I wonder if there is a potion to outright block external influences. Oh, Rubeus, I think that if such a thing could be brewed, it would have been already. The professor's barely suppressed peal of laughter underlined the rolling eyes of Minerva, who muttered something that sounded suspiciously like of course. He's thinking about potions. I was also wondering if I could repurpose the Fidelius. What if I can place the secret of my thoughts into my own soul? The unnaturally tall student scratched his left cheek for a second, before returning to the present and addressing his head of house. Well, potions can more or less achieve anything, provided the brewer is capable enough and in possession of the right ingredients. Hagrid spoke out loud, while he leaned forward. His hand missing his empty glass by an inch when he attempted to pick it up from the coffee table. That a cure for lycanthropy hasn't been found yet is more likely to be caused by a lack of the latter rather than the first. After all, the curse has been around for millennia, and extraordinary potion makers must have been around. Sometimes I forget about your Slytherin-esque ambition, Rubeus. Minerva pinched her nose in faux exasperation, but it was clear to see that she was thinking about the unnaturally tall third year's suggestion about asking Dumbledore for instruction in occlumency. What was the project of your first year? Unaided flight. Orion didn't miss the implications of what Hagrid had just said. Even if the Black Heir was just starting to know the unnaturally tall third year, he could easily see just how much he could accomplish with something resembling founding or endorsement from a family such as the Blacks. At least if his skill was anything comparable with the naked ambition discernible in his ideas. If a pixie can fly, you can bet your wand that I'll learn how to do the same. Hagrid hunched forward on his enlarged seat, his palms resting on his knees for a couple of seconds before he leaned back into the armchair once more, his expression forlorn as he eyed his empty glass. Slughorn captured Orion's eyes for a second then, only to minutely nod towards the slightly inebriated, freakishly sized Slytherin. Slughorn seems to believe in him. That made Orion's eyebrows climb up to his hairline while he sipped for the first time the beverage handed to him by the potion professor. You want to learn how to fly and to find a cure for lycanthropy. The Black Heir summed up, anything else that even Merlin would think impossible. The question was rhetorical, but from the sly smile Hagrid exhibited, Orion was sure that the answer was affirmative. And you have any idea about how to accomplish either? I haven't gotten around to plan how to fly yet, no. The unnaturally tall Slytherin stretched in his enlarged seat, his long arms and humongous hands reaching far above his head. And once more, everyone present caught the implication, but I have an idea about how to cure lycanthropy. You mentioned the lack of ingredients. Riddle's interest was now focused on the much taller student. It doesn't look like something you can easily affect. Hagrid waved a single finger in Tom's direction. But the answer is deceptively simple, isn't it? We use plants and parts of animals to prepare our potions, even our wands are made with those two components. If I lack an ingredient, then I simply have to make one. Minerva returned into the conversation with a thoughtful hum. You did mention crossbreeding once before. This is his solution? Mashing together animals until something useful pops out? Orion didn't bother hiding his disdainful scoff at the idea while he peered at the unnaturally tall Slytherin, who grinned openly, almost challengingly, at the other people present. Hippogriffs were realized leveraging pride, among other things. From the absent nodding of both Riddle and McGonagall, it was clear that those three AHD already faced the topic. Instead of working from the already existing lion and eagle, I simply have to imagine the pieces I'd need, and work backwards. I'm sure there are a way or 20 to transfer a property of a creature to a single part of the whole. If I'm not mistaken, one of the principles of alchemy is about bringing together different properties. The head of House Slytherin mused out loud, the hand not holding his by now empty glass rose to his chin. I had an interesting conversation with Albus a few years ago, but I can't seem to remember its finer academical points. The deep bout of laughter from Hagrid managed to once more reverberate uncomfortably in Orion's ribcage, who beared it while he observed the other wizards zero in on the opportunity hinted at by Slughorn. If only we knew someone that Professor Dumbledore would be willing to teach to on the side. Minerva. The Slytherin prefect affected surprise by widening his eyes and not quite covering his mouth with his left hand. You're already studying advanced topics with him, aren't you? Riddle noted idly, a slow smile appearing on his features while he turned slightly towards the Gryffindor witch. Maybe you could is about alchemy, who knows, maybe you've got a knack for it. And we both know just how much you actually like learning something new. You only want to profit from my notes on the subject once I've worked through the bulk of the hurdles. Minerva's eyes narrowed at Riddle, who shrugged while opening his hands, as if to say that it was an obvious conclusion. Returning to the crossbreeding, Orion interjected before the annoyed witch could pull her wand on the admittedly infuriating wizards needling her. And ignoring its intricacies and pitfalls, there are far more practical issues. Hagrid turned once more in his enlarged seat, frowning at the Black Heir, such as the logistic, for one. Orion raised an unimpressed eyebrow. Magical creatures need care, often an expensive one. Even if dragons are on one extreme, maintaining even a hippogriff herd isn't easy. From the occasional obliviation to protect the statute, to proper wards keeping creatures from wandering where they shouldn't, to the specialized caretakers needed to harvest what they naturally shed. I get it. Hagrid huffed irritably. Money is the big answer to any mundane problem, isn't it? Such is the way of the world. The Black Heir smiled thinly as an answer, holding back the urge to stretch his legs. One would think that even the dumbest wizard should be able to see the inherent advantage into a greater biodiversity. Hagrid frowned distastefully at Orion's words. If you are serious in your endeavor, once you leave Hogwarts I'd be pleased to write a letter or two, my boy. Slughorn smiled as he reminded everyone that he was a consummate Slytherin. Mr. Scamander was a student here not that long ago, and he has recently published an almost revolutionary work about the care of magical creatures. The Black Heir held back a scornful reply. For all of his undeniable skills in the caring of animals of any kind, the more or less infamous Scamander didn't understand the people he so desperately tried to convince to change the approach of. I wouldn't want to phrase the safeguard of creatures of any kind as a business, but biodiversity means that there are more possibilities for wizard kind, which is something that could rally the needed support for your project. Once you leave Hogwarts, Rubeus Minerva added with a suspicious glare, which was met with raised arms and the universal gesture of surrender. How far do expansion charms go? Hagrid tried to redirect the conversation while he exchanged an excited grin with Riddle, who apparently had no difficulty in following the thoughts of the younger student. Because one of the difficulties of maintaining animals is the space they require, but if a crack in the ground can somehow be transfigured into a valley, well, you'd still need to convince a rather large number of people to join your project. Orion pointed out with a roll of his eyes. Hagrid seemed to type to constantly dream too big with not an ounce of the needed preparation. I hoped that with magic compromise wouldn't be necessary. Hagrid let out an almost explosive breath while he cast his head back, his eyes looking aimlessly at the ceiling. The small group shared a few moments of companionable silence while Slughorn nursed his drink, his cheeks positively flush because of the alcohol. You could always conquer a country and force the local ministry to do your bidding. Minerva chortled after she emptied her own glass, her drink finally finished, but I think that you'd find the paperwork to be worse than the still present need to deal with people you find uninteresting. And with those words, the unnaturally tall Slytherin stilled for a single moment, his relaxed posture locking in place for several seconds before he looked back at the Gryffindor witch. Orion, in his politically savvy mind, barely held back a flinch, while Riddle's expression had gone blank, as if anticipating the words that were about to come. Maybe I should, shouldn't I? The tipsy Rubeus bared his teeth, almost like a wolf, somehow managing to appear utterly menacing despite his still being sprawled into his enlarged armchair. I could find myself a mountain range, or an island, claim it, and name myself king. Minerva frowned at the challenging tone, but she answered with a shrug, well, you'd be able to make your ramblings on biodiversity matter. How dismissive. Orion eyed askance at the Gryffindor witch, but he refrained from commenting. Instead of answering, Hagrid remained sprawled in his chair, his eyes staring hollowly forward as if seeing something completely different than the room they had been sharing for the past lengthy and diverse conversation. And then, just when the attention of the small group started to slide off him, just when Slughorn managed to shake himself out of his small daze as he noticed the late hour, Rubeus hummed. It wasn't the distracted hum one did for himself while thinking about something completely different, it wasn't the occasional rumble of laughter that had annoyingly resonated with Orion's ribcage during the unusual evening. It was a loud, deep sound that escaped from the closed lips of the unnaturally tall Slytherin. A vibration that held the imposing presence of the very mountains he had just mentioned. The sound rose and fell into a lull, repeating itself twice before Hagrid opened his mouth. His voice rumbled low enough to reverberate in the breastbones of those next to him, and that halted any half-hearted attempt to divert the Slytherin from his newly discovered singing talent, a king he was on carven throne. Rubeus rose from his seat with barely any sway to his movements while he kept singing, in many pillared halls of stone. With a clear parting nod towards his head of house, he turned to leave, his voice growing louder as he appeared to barely hold back a peal of laughter. With golden roof and silver floor. He waved idly at the students flabbergasted by the unexpected change in his behavior and he left the room, and runes of power upon the door. Chapter 47, Author's Note. Okay, I've tried, but honestly, I cannot hope to bring this story forward. Not without adding to support it and to weave the events acting as a framework. The main characters will remain of course Rubeus, Tom, and Minerva. I used Dumbledore and Slughorn to offer some support to the events already, but going forward, considering the sheer scope I want this FIC to have, I need to add people. Given the fact that we're still so far from canon, I'll have to rely on the grandparents of Harry's generation to act out minor roles, and while I'll refer to the usual website as a starting point, I've already spotted instances in which, like Minerva, a character has multiple dates of birth, so I'll have to adjust accordingly. That is to say, including this arc, I've laid the foundations for the story, and it has been the most massive world building I have ever attempted, considering that I managed to weave characterization into it. All the characters that I'll need you readers to have a passing familiarity with now have personalities, motivations, and main interests, so I'm finally able to return to the progression of the plot, and to push on the gas a bit. Up until now, the story was somewhat still. Sure, everyone researched or experimented, but there was precious little action. The only things actually exciting have been Hagrid's ritual and the recovery of the Diadem. And I kind of wanted the story to be static during Hagrid's time at school, because forging drama for the sake of drama isn't really up my alley, and I'm not really one for casual opponents that get forgotten going forward. I really don't want to waste time and effort on a character that I'll eventually drop. But with the last arc we got into a position that allows me to create credible conflict that doesn't scream railroad like with the random vampires back in Albania, we'll see more about that in the next chapters, which should hopefully be a little easier, faster, to write. About Orion. I need other minor characters to be present in the story before I make use of them. I don't want to create a character to solve a problem in the same chapter that problem is revealed, that'd be just bad planning on my part. So I'll present other secondary chapters here and there while I go on with the main plot. In any case, I present you Orion Black, born in 1929, and said to be good at warding. The fandom states he was the one to provide Grimmauld Place with the mysterious wards that made the place ideal for being chosen as the Order's base. And yes, Orion is Sirius' father in canon. I wanted to experiment by adding a character that isn't drawn by interest in magic. I hope I managed to build a character that is different from my favorite standard, and I super hope that the conversation that took place among Slughorn, Minerva, Rubeus, and Tom, managed to be smooth despite the vast amount of foreshadowing and lore that I've dropped into it. Basing ourselves on canon, we can say that nothing is known about Orion's personality, so I'm going for a ruthless politician build. He's your typical pureblood, but in the interest of using somewhat known characters without dumping 50k words on their development, given the minor impact they'll have on the story, I'm giving him a pragmatic twist. Hopes for his character and subplot? Ideas? About Tom. I really wasn't sure what to do with him. I agree that he cannot accept not the best as a state of being, but now the accessed the actual secrets of the chamber, which I was thinking of as a collection of Salazar's works, plus the basilisk he has options to prove himself better than Hagrid without going full nuclear on the school. So, I've foreshadowed a couple of things in this arc, but we'll see them explode in the following chapters, and I've decided on some stuff to inject some much needed adrenaline into this story. You'll see soon, I promise. About the Slug Club. I didn't want the standard dinner plus brown-nosing start in the Slug Club for our MC. I hope I managed to give a clear picture of how intertwined his extracurricular activities are with his regular schoolwork, and I openly admit that I dislike how the chat with Hagrid Riddle-McGonagall Slughorn Black went. It is extremely difficult to balance so many elements, exceedingly so with the third person colored by Orion's opinions. How did it go? I used it to touch several interesting lore-related topics, as well as to inject some foreshadowing. Any ideas about how I can better manage this kind of meeting? There will be other round tables going on with the story, even if I hope they'll have a clearly defined aim, instead of the random networking engineered by Slughorn. Mind Arts. I used the brief mention of Mind Arts to clearly state why any problem can't be solved by the use of a Pensiev or a dose of Veritas serum. I simply can ill tolerate all the FICS in which those two are paraded as revolutionary instruments to solve the Death Eater out of Azkaban after the fall of Voldemort debacle. Chapter 48, Harry Potter, Chapter 47, Cause I. Riddle left the classroom that had been commandeered by some older students with a faint smile on his face and triumph singing in his eyes. The fool purebloods that were part of the dueling club had dared to mock him at Slughorn's party, they had doubted his worth, his skill, his might. They no longer will. Elegant wordplay and subtle, but deep, understanding of magic weren't enough to place the poor orphan Riddle where he deserved to be, not when those that by right of age and birth somewhat ruled House Slytherin, those respected scions of ancient families that could barely distinguish one end of the wand from the other. So Tom had simply led those brutes. Their enjoyment of the dueling club and inflated sense of worth made them easy to manipulate into accepting a friendly spar. The memory of the fools being battered around with no hope of victory made Riddle briefly touch his wand, feeling the triumphant exultance that thrummed through him, warming up his blood and making him luxuriate in the certainty of his ever-growing power. He strode purposefully across the hallways and the corridors, exchanging perfectly nice smiles and well-practiced hellos while he slowly brought his heart to a manageable rate. The wild triumph that he felt could hardly be expressed publicly after all. He had never participated in the dueling club as he had no need nor wish to advertise his skills for the whole school to see, but that almost made it too easy to trick those fools at Slughorn's party to fall for a challenge that he had never actually voiced. And those idiots that so strongly believed in the might of their wands, those that thought themselves atop the laughable food chain of Hogwarts, would now need to re-evaluate their principles. And Tom had made sure to place himself as the only one capable of showing them a way to remain at the top, using spells that few of those fools had ever heard of to magnificent effects. I sowed, now I simply have to wait for the harvest. The people he had elegantly humiliated had already been thinking about retaliation, he knew that much, even if it had been easy to show just how of their reach Riddle actually was, wielding their beliefs about pure blood dogma against them had been even easier. The cognitive dissonance that he could taste of the hot-headed duelists had been a delight, and the implicit insinuation that he was above them because of his blood, secret as it was, had been a mere bonus. A part of Tom was already tasting the next steps. How would they try to reclaim their broken ego? Would they ambush him? No, not after his display. They'll likely try their hand against someone they despise and that they don't fear. With a shrug, he left behind the well-lit corridors and started to wade through the slightly damp dungeons, walking areas of the castle that had been ignored in many a generation, until he reached the now familiar access to the Chamber of Secrets. With a couple of silent charms to ensure he wasn't being followed, he slid away from the glum corridor and entered the chamber that he had discovered, that he had gained access to by blood and by might. Soon he reached the main room, and without stopping he walked up to Salazar's face and above the black pitch that was the now empty resting place of the basilisk. With a certainty to his step that he was careful to conceal in any other environment, he almost prowled to the series of studies and private chambers that were secured beyond the reach of anyone but the heir of Slytherin, and he sat to a desk that he had claimed as his favorite, books that he had left ready opening for him at the desired pages after a twitch of his pale wand. A self-satisfied smile blossomed on his features and his dark eyes widened in the eagerness to devour every slip of knowledge available to him. He started to wade through the pages of impossible squiggly lines that were not a direct phonetic translation of Parseltongue. Differently from what he'd have suspected if he had to imagine writing in the noble tongue, the alphabet used wasn't phonetic, as the English one, but each small line of ink carried with it a separate significance, only to form shapes with a precise, and oftentimes complex, meaning. By reading those out loud, however, Riddle had discovered that his tongue moved almost knowingly, lips and throat accommodated the unnatural sounds with the ease that a fish had in swimming, and that his mind, once he heard what he said, understood exactly what his ancestor had written. Tom had never stopped to think about the difficulty inherent in reading thousand-years-old books when he had discovered the private collection of his ancestor, but learning that Parseltongue almost acted like a key to unlock the knowledge in those tomes had made him ecstatic, and everything in Parseltongue to him sounded like common English. Truly, it was a marvel of magic with uncountable applications once he managed to figure out the reasoning and symbol behind it. The only downside was the need to read out loud, because for some quirky need of the magic involved, his mind was not able to directly understand the symbols on the pages. He understood snakes because he could hear Parseltongue, and he could speak to them because he was a Parselmouth. Slowly, producing sounds that could have sounded like skittering glass over bare bones to the ears of anyone else, he began to read. To exchange an object with another is to swap their nature, and while that can be accomplished easily with things similar in nature, a wizard that knows deeply every element of what his magic attempts to influence, can push the limits of. Hours later, the immense basilisk slithered into the chamber from one of the many tunnels that led to the pipes running into the castle, its thick scales almost grinding on the wet tiles under its immeasurable weight, and Tom closed the book he had been perusing with a self-satisfied quirk of his lips, a twitch of his U-wand enough to bound the notes he had been putting together as he rose from his seated position. Since he had managed to access the true secrets of the room, by Parseltongue, magic, and will, Riddle had found what had to be the private rooms of his fabled ancestor, and while the sleeping arrangements would require much work to become viable, Tom was hardly interested in menial work. He had been in awe at the collection of knowledge now available to him. Images and instincts were blurred together in the written form of Parseltongue, and the talent that Riddle had been born with was the only key capable of unlocking that trove of knowledge. Riddle walked out of one of the private rooms of his ancestor with a slight swagger to his pace. It was hard to contain the pride he felt. He had proved himself worthy of the chamber by being able to open it, and the basilisk recognized Tom as her master, as it was right. Master, the hiss had the underling, rumbling tone of an uninterested wind, but Tom could hardly take offense. Snakes didn't have a human's perception of hierarchy, there was no possible brown-nosing, no uncertainty. The basilisk was king of all snakes, and the line of Slytherin, who had hatched the female specimen that now was roughly 1,000 years old, was its rightful master. The salutations that the wizard exchanged with the ancient creature were more recognition of each other's presence than an excuse to establish and confirm their places on the command ladder. Much easier than the small-time politicking implicit in the hellos I have to exchange with the others, if nothing else. If you like the story so far, please throw some power stones. Equals. If you want to read ahead of the public release, you can join my Patreon. patreon.com/darkness013. Comment. 0 comment. Vote. Chapter 49, Harry Potter, Chapter 48, Cause 2. The salutations that the wizard exchanged with the ancient creature were more recognition of each other's presence than an excuse to establish and confirm their places on the command ladder. Much easier than the small-time politicking implicit in the hellos I have to exchange with the others, if nothing else. Now that he thought about it, that mechanic was remarkably similar to how Hagrid held himself around others, even with the professors. The pretense of obedience was paper-thin. Not that he'd ignore their instructions, but it was clear to Riddle that the option of doing as he pleased was always present in Rubeus' mind. He chose to pretend to be just another student, and the teachers were too blind to notice, too used to the image they were offered by all the students, never mind that his unnaturally tall companion was blatantly different. Oh, Dumbledore probably knew, but he had divined enough of Rubeus' character to not poke at the incongruence, and Slughorn earned too much by letting Hagrid act with such a long leash. Almost mirroring his younger friend, Riddle often twisted the surface of his behavior to cater to the expectations of so many of his schoolmates. He had learned early that not fitting the boxes that others instinctively put you in only brought pain in some form or another, and while he would have certainly delighted in picking apart the ever-pretentious purebloods that lorded their birth above him like it was an accomplishment worthy of his praise, he would have loved tricking those fools into betraying everything they stood for merely for the delicious irony that picture would represent. But since Dumbledore's visit to the orphanage, Tom had realized that his usual and effective methods that showcased his vast superiority built on the tears of the lesser beings that dared intrude upon him couldn't be used. And as he often had to, Riddle had adapted in order to be in charge without making it obvious to any observer. He had acted so that he'd be the one the other students would turn to, pure blood or not. Of course, his natural brilliance with magic had helped where his official status as a mudblood had hindered him. Oh, if only they knew. Greetings. The somewhat unnatural sound left Tom's lips by virtue of the magic in his blood, and the basilisk's poisonous yellow eyes flashed innocently and harmlessly in his direction before the creature started to curl on itself. Did you hunt well? The following hiss sounded almost amused, carrying with it undertones that briefly escaped the human's understanding, but it could be summed up as a disdainful sniff. After all, the basilisk was the most dangerous creature on the planet, never mind the forbidden forest that the king of snakes could reach through the black lake and a river that ran deep under the boughs. Still, Riddle felt an echoing pride ring inside of himself. He'd have to keep this secret. Of course, the basilisk had to be kept under wraps as it was meant to defend the castle, and gods knew what Hagrid would try to do with access to the creature, never mind the entirety of the wizarding world. No, very much like Riddle had decided to keep the Runda only for himself, Minerva, and Rubeus, he'd now hold the creature's existence only for himself. Revealing himself as the last of Salazar's line would make even those purebloods that still resisted his charm and skills fall to their knees in a matter of seconds, but that would mean giving undeniable proof of his might, not only as a Parselmouth, but also as Slytherin's heir. He even had some form of plan murmuring in the back of his head. After all, the basilisk could easily be directed towards a single student if Tom framed them as a threat to Hogwarts, and arguably mudbloods threatened constantly the statute. A part of Tom even reflected upon the merits of having the basilisk kill Hagrid. It wasn't that the younger Slytherin student was no longer useful, far from that, simply, his apparently never-ending winning streak when it came to anything that wasn't perfectly framed in schoolwork somewhat irked at Tom's sense of worth. Wasn't he the best student in the school? Wasn't he the heir of Slytherin? How could Rubeus dare to shine so brightly? A memory of wooden doors being turned in a single uninterrupted chain of transfigurations that defied belief stopped that particular sequence of thoughts, and Tom forced himself to take a deep breath. While he had known about Minerva's skill in transfiguration before Rubeus's intervention back in his first year, that she had proved herself capable of so much was just unreasonable. How did Hagrid know that she'd be so worthy? For all of Tom's disregard for the mediocre and the pampered, there was no denying that bringing the lackluster in his opinion at least Minerva in the group that had created the Runda had been an extraordinarily lucky guess. She took a while to prove herself, and she could hardly keep up in the many different fields that Riddle and Hagrid sparred across, but she entered their little game of the Black King with a magnificent first move. That too, irked at Riddle's sense of worth, if only minutely. He hadn't dared to bring up Minerva's worth with Hagrid, not after his uncommon display at Slughorn's after-party. A part of the unnaturally tall Slytherin would have attempted to milk her introduction to Tom for all of its worth, while the rest of him would have simply crooned about his still unproved ability to discern those that were truly cut from a different cloth. McGonagall had hardly been someone that could catch Riddle's attention when thinking about magic, and the past years had hardly challenged that suspicion, yet, out of nowhere, she turned wooden double doors in an artwork that defied expectation, never mind understanding. All that Tom knew of transfiguration told him that the bespelled doors should be so unstable that each change was an instant away from cascading into the next. All that Tom knew about potions implied the need for magical ingredients to obtain anything that couldn't be explained by a muggle. Riddle-edged to let go of the pretenses, to unleash the basilisk, and to be done with the doubts that some people still nurtured about his position in the world. One last hiss left Tom's lips as he moved out of the chamber, knowing that the basilisk would heed his commands of not revealing herself to humans. He felt almost giddy at having her in his service, but he wouldn't put his position at risk by ordering her to attack, not when there was no reason to. Not yet. I slowly stretched back in the suitably enlarged armchair that I had placed next to a lit fireplace, feeling the strain in the muscles of my back as I took a deep breath. After a moment, my hands started to organize the stack of papers that I had filled with notes and observations, scattering them over a nearby desk in a parody of order that nevertheless allowed me to keep an eye on the few realizations I had at the same time. It was not unlike having more than one monitor open next to another, showing similar but distinct topics. In particular, the main focus of those notes was intertwined research on divination and arithmancy. I chose those two subjects both because I knew that actual prophecy was a thing and because I already received proof that some numbers could be important, and I wasn't referring only to my meta-knowledge. The 3 books: Secrets of the Darkest Arts, Magic Most Evil, and the Theory of Rituals. The magic of sacrifice that I had stolen from the restricted section during my first year and that had led me to the ritual that actually sacrificed a human being. I swallowed a familiar lump of guilt and disgust at the memory of roots sprouting from the skin of my father had more or less confirmed, along with my instinctive understanding of potions, that some numbers had an effect, and an important one at that. The first lessons in arithmancy had been dedicated to the importance of some numbers, without actually giving a context that explained why those numbers were relevant. 3 for stability, 7 for power, 13 for focus, as it was a direct sum between 6 and 7, providing the stability of 2 3s and the might of 1 7, and so on. Slowly, I rose from my seat and distractedly touched my holly and phoenix wand, enjoying the reassuring warmth that rushed along my arm while my eyes kept scanning the result of my reasonings and mad scrambles for the set of rules that defined a particular branch of magic. Giving a glance to the syllabus told me that there would be formulae and calculations in the second half of the academic year. Basically, I was going to learn a wholly skewed mathematical system, and I had no idea about the why. The best I could say with certainty at the moment was that in the same way the golden ration appeared everywhere in nature, some numbers were significant in a magical context. Of course, I hadn't needed to understand the true importance of the number 3 back when I had performed that successful ritual. And that was what made arithmancy so extraordinary. In potions, the meaning of each ingredient was enhanced by the understanding of the brewer. I had proved that to great effect with both my experiments and the outrageous quality of my standard brews. But the numbers had a power that was inherent, and that lent itself to everything that had them present. Maybe it's better to see arithmancy as a whole as applied numerology. I muttered to myself as I scratched my cheek. The meaning of numbers, which is inherent, can be leveraged in different ways. Chapter 50, Harry Potter, Chapter 49, Cause 3. But the numbers had a power that was inherent, and that lent itself to everything that had them present. Maybe it's better to see arithmancy as a whole as applied numerology. I muttered to myself as I scratched my cheek. The meaning of numbers, which is inherent, can be leveraged in different ways. Shifting my eyes to the other set of papers, I started to follow the colored ink that attempted to draw parallels between the arithmancy section and the divination whatever. While the first was at its core simple, in the same way the basis of calculus could be simple, the latter was hazy. The entire syllabus of divination was separated into sub-branches: oneiromancy, tarots, reading of tea leaves, and whatnot. All of those were attempts, more or less successful from user to user, to get a glimpse of the future. Arithmancy made an appearance from time to time, when using cards to read the future. For example, the different kinds of dealings had different chances to be successful based on a multitude of factors, that ranged from the object, or topic you wanted to divine, to the celestial configuration at the time of the reading. Instead of having the bastard child of math and semiotics, divination was more akin to painting, and each sub-branch was a different brush. From my incomplete understanding of the subject, I couldn't guess of a single reason why oneiromancy, tarots, and reading of tea leaves couldn't be used to aim at a single object, each brush refining the details that would escape another. Then again, the efficiency of each method. I frowned, adding a note on another piece of parchment. If they are brushes, the precision of all but one of those might be meaningless. After all, if something so obvious wasn't already an accepted practice, it was more than likely that there was a good reason for it. Meta-knowledge or not, I was hardly the first person with a working brain to ever study magic. With a sigh, I dared a look at my quote of what Tom had said at Slughorn's after-party, which deserved a parchment of its own: the mind exerts will, the body has strength, magic holds power, and the soul is a reflection of them all. Glancing at the clock, I shook my head and turned my back on my notes. I had the first session with Orion Black, and given the obscene amount of resources that he could make available to me, as Slughorn had pointed out, I could put in the effort of giving him a helping hand now that he needed one. Tom's words made sense to me in a way that few things outside of potion making did. I left the safe confines of the Runda with a last odd glance at the double doors that Minerva had realized, and I added them to the endless list of research topics that kept growing despite my steadfast and almost hungry approach when it came to learning magic. For now, lycanthropy remained my priority, and given my last experiment, or at least its implications, I had a couple of ideas on how to proceed. The cloudy sky prevented the sun from shining into the hallways and corridors of Hogwarts, and the incoming winter had recently made itself known even inside the castle. We were far from having snow, but there was a chill in the air that made everyone wish for an armchair in front of a fireplace, and hot tea. I ignored the slight discomfort caused by the cold while my wand found itself in my hand. As easily as I breathed, the picture of a single tongue of golden flame blossomed into my mind. The wavering of hot air and the relaxing of muscles that accompanied a warm bath surrounded that image immediately, and with a twirl of my length of holly, the air touching my skin lost its bite. I rolled my shoulders as I left the area of the 4th floor that Minerva and Tom had helped me steal away from the common students in my first year, a self-satisfied smile appearing on my features as I abandoned the formamentus needed to perform what had been not a mere nonverbal spell, but incantation-less magic. Wizard-kind needed symbols to do magic in a controlled manner, they acted as a bridge between meaning and a tangible result. But all of that took place inside the head of the caster. Incantations and wand movements were mere confirmations for the body that the wizard or witch in question was actually trying to cast something. As Riddle had revealed, a mind exercised will, a body had strength, and magic held power, but will was nothing else than the hazy element that linked together what already existed with what we wanted to make real. Our body has strength, obviously enough, but what it actually meant was that it rooted us in the reality that already was, instead of what was going to be once magic happened. Finally, magic had the power to rewrite everything else, both our mind and our bodies. Mind, body, magic, the elements that Riddle had quoted were in relation to each other, it was undeniable. Hadn't the mere possibility of doing magic brought me to decide to sacrifice Hagrid's father? That was proof that the power of magic could turn your own mind into something different than what it was. Potions and spells clearly could affect the body too, and I didn't need to look any further than Minerva for the most obvious confirmation. Through our bodies, we experienced the world around us, which of course influenced our thoughts, and didn't my innate magical resistance prove that our bodies could work with or against magic? Any random magical creature could prove the same. Finally, the mind shaped our every action, and directed our body. It was as if mind, body, and magic sat at the points of a triangle, and each side was a two-way road between those three elements. And the soul sits in the center of the triangle, perfectly reflecting each side and point. I had tried to sidestep the more or less nonsensical incantations and wand movements since day one at Hogwarts, since I knew they weren't truly necessary, and I had maintained a good success in all of my subjects since then. Was it because I was half giant, and so my body was better suited to perform magic with no need for a precise frame of reference? Was it because I was an adult in mind and soul? I had no idea. The only way to test it was to attempt to teach how I understood magic to a group of 11 years old children, but at that age, kids simply aren't mentally equipped to deal with abstracted concepts. Another group of control would need to be composed by half-breeds. Lost in my musings, I crossed the 4 floors that separated me from the dungeons and one of the empty classrooms in which I was to meet Orion Black, and it was likely because of those thoughts that I didn't realize the ambush until I was in the exact middle of it. An older student leisurely walked out from an alcove placed a few steps ahead of me, the Gryffindor colors of his tie and nasty grin telling me all I needed to know while I glanced over my shoulder to spot another 2 goons that were already holding their wands at the ready. Should I call myself lucky that I managed to avoid trouble inside the castle up until now? When the one in front of me started to open his mouth, a taunt of some sort already on his lips, I prevented him by casting the first spell. Really, bantering with what I could see only as children really wasn't something I wanted to waste my time on.
Thanks for listening.